If you think a princess only knows how to bow and obey, then you have never met Lisara Varen. She grew up inside a palace built on lies, trained to become a political pawn. But tonight, in the mud and blood of a battlefield, that woman is dying at the hands of the man who swore to destroy every drop of her bloodline. And when he tears off her helmet, both their worlds shatter into pieces. This is the story of a princess who refused the golden cage, and a wolf king who learned to love again from the very beginning. Stay until the end, because the finale will leave you breathless. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. Let's begin. The morning Lisara Varen turned 19, her father gave her a gift wrapped in gold ribbon and smelling faintly of old parchment and ambition. It was a marriage contract. She stood in the high-ceilinged receiving room of the Durnhold Palace, marble floors cold even through her silk slippers, morning light cutting through arched windows in long, pale strips. And she read every word of that document with the careful attention her tutors had drilled into her since childhood. 3 pages, 12 clauses. Her name written in formal script at the top, followed by the name of a man she had never met. Lord Edric Thane of the Coastal Houses, a man her intelligence sources told her was 47 years old, twice widowed, and known in certain circles for his cruelty to servants. Her father, King Aldrich Varen, first of his name, protector of the Durnhold realm, watched her read from his throne-like chair at the head of the long table, his fingers laced together, his expression carrying that particular brand of patient certainty that powerful men wear when they already know the outcome of a conversation. "Well?" he said when she reached the final page. Lisara set the contract down on the polished table. She smoothed the front of her gown with both hands, a habit she'd developed as a child whenever she needed a moment to compose what was happening inside her chest before it reached her face. "He's 47, she said. "He commands a fleet of 200 ships and controls the eastern trade routes," her father replied. "His alliance would double our naval strength before winter. He buried 2 wives. Both died of illness. It was documented. By his own physicians." Her father's jaw tightened, just barely, just enough for her to notice, because she had been reading his face since she was 4 years old, and she knew every crack in his composure the way a sailor knows the rocks beneath familiar water. "You are being dramatic," he said. "I am being accurate," she said. "There is a difference." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. Her father unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the table, a deliberate motion, measured, the kind a man makes when he is reminding himself that he is a king and therefore does not raise his voice in receiving rooms. "Lisara," his tone shifted, "you are a princess of Durnhold. Your value to this kingdom is political," she finished. "Yes, I know. I have always known." She had known it the way she knew the color of her own eyes. Green, her mother's eyes. Though her mother had been gone since Lisara was 6, and there were days she could barely remember the woman's voice. She had known it in the way the palace staff deferred to her in the hallways but looked past her in strategy meetings. She had known it when her father had dismissed her suggestion at age 14 that Durnhold's border defenses were dangerously understaffed, and then spent the following 2 years quietly reinforcing those exact defenses, and never once acknowledging that the idea had come from her. She was decorative. She was useful. She was a piece to be moved. "Sign the contract," her father said. "The wedding is planned for the spring equinox. Lord Thane will arrive in 6 weeks for the formal introduction." Lisara picked up the document. She held it for a long moment with both hands. Then she folded it in half, set it back on the table, and walked out of the room. Iwoti. She had been planning her escape for 2 years, not impulsively, not in the feverish romantic way of stories where a young woman ties bedsheets together and runs into the night with stars in her eyes and no real plan. Lisara had approached her escape the way she approached everything, with research, patience, and a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. She had begun with the palace itself, learning the guard rotations, which sentries changed shifts when, which hallways went unwalked between midnight and the 3rd hour, which sections of the outer wall were oldest and therefore least monitored because everyone assumed the stone itself was barrier enough. She had learned over months of careful observation that the East Servants' Gate was staffed by a single guard on rainy nights, because the second guard consistently took shelter in the adjacent gatehouse. She had memorized the patrol patterns of the palace dogs. She had studied the stable assignments until she knew which horses were fastest, which were least likely to be missed in the morning count, and which groom left work early on Thursdays. She had also been training. This part had been harder to arrange. A princess requesting combat instruction was not, in itself, unusual. Many noble women learned basic defensive swordsmanship, the kind taught in neat lessons in sunlit courtyards with padded blades and patient instructors who never pushed too hard. That was not what Lysara wanted. She wanted the other kind. She had found it, eventually, in the form of a retired soldier named Sergeant Wren Collis, who had lost the lower half of his left arm in a border skirmish 15 years ago, and had been quietly employed by the palace ever since, in an administrative capacity that involved mostly shuffling papers and occasionally training junior guards in hand-to-hand defense. Wren was 42, sharp-eyed, and possessed of a deep, abiding distrust of nobility that he had never bothered to conceal because he had long ago decided that his position was too minor for anyone to care about his opinions. He had been surprised when the princess appeared in the training yard one Thursday evening. The quiet one, the one nobody used because it was on the wrong side of the stables and caught too much wind. "Your Highness," he'd said, in the tone of a man calculating quickly whether he was about to be in trouble. "I want you to teach me how to fight," she'd said. "Actually fight, not the courtyard kind." He'd stared at her. "Why?" "Because I'm leaving this palace eventually," she'd said, "and when I do, I intend to survive." He had looked at her for a long moment, this 19-year-old girl in a traveling cloak, standing in a windy training yard with mud on her slippers, and a steadiness in her eyes that didn't match the softness of her silk clothes. And he had made a decision. "Come back tomorrow night," he'd said. "Wear something you can move in." That had been 2 years ago. In those 2 years, Wren had taught her how to hold a blade correctly. Not the elegant grip of formal dueling, but the low, economical grip of someone who intended to keep hold of their weapon even when exhausted. He had taught her how to take a hit and keep moving, how to use her smaller size as an advantage rather than a liability, how to read an opponent's body before their weapon moved. He had taught her to fall without injuring herself, which she had initially thought was a minor skill, until she understood that the ability to survive falling down was, in many situations, the difference between continuing to fight and dying on the ground. He had also, quietly and without ceremony, taught her things that weren't on any formal curriculum: how to read a battlefield from a distance, how to move in a group of soldiers without standing out, how to tend a wound in the field when there was no physician available, and how to endure pain without showing it on your face. That last one, he'd told her once, sitting on an overturned crate after a particularly brutal sparring session that had left her with bruised ribs and a split lip, is the one that'll keep you alive more than any of the rest. She'd looked at him, breathing through the pain in her side. "More than knowing how to use a blade? A sword can be taken from you," he'd said. "A man can be stronger than you, faster than you, better trained than you, but if he can't tell how badly you're hurting, he doesn't know when to finish you. And that gap," he'd tapped his temple, "that's where you win." She had carried that lesson like a second heartbeat ever since. The night she left, it was raining. Of course it was raining. She had waited 3 weeks after the morning with the marriage contract, 3 weeks of performing absolute normalcy with the precision of a stage actor who knew she was being watched. She attended the dinners. She smiled at the required moments. She sat through her father's strategy meetings in the appropriate decorative capacity and kept her thoughts entirely off her face. She accepted, graciously, a small gift sent by Lord Thane, a pearl bracelet sent ahead as a gesture of courtship, and wore it twice in public so the news would reach him that she'd been pleased. She was not pleased. On the 22nd night, when the rain came down in cold, heavy sheets and the east servants' gate was down to a single guard, who had retreated to the gatehouse as reliably as ever, Lysara left the palace for the last time. She wore the uniform of a junior infantry soldier, brown wool and hardened leather, helmet slightly too large, face wrapped against the cold in a way that was practical for the weather and convenient for her purposes. She had bound her chest, cut her hair to jaw length, and stolen dog tags from a supply room she had identified 3 months earlier as the one used to outfit new recruits. The name on the tags read Syl Varen, a name she had chosen carefully, close enough to her own that she might answer to it instinctively, different enough to provide cover. She carried a pack with 3 days of rations, a change of clothes, her sword, a proper one, not a training blade, and the pearl bracelet, which she had considered leaving behind but ultimately taken because it might be worth something if she needed to barter. She walked out through the East Servants' Gate in the rain, and the guard in the gatehouse did not look up from his cards. She did not look back. The Durnhold army was mobilizing. This was not, she discovered when she made contact with the recruiting station at the border garrison 2 days later, a coincidence of timing. It was the timing. War with Ironvale had been building for months in the way that large, terrible things build, through the accumulation of smaller provocations, border incidents, trade disputes, and the specific kind of pride that belongs to powerful men who have decided they have been wronged. The Kingdom of Ironvale. She had grown up hearing stories about Ironvale the way children grew up hearing stories about winter wolves, something distant and dangerous and fundamentally other. A kingdom of shifters, ruled by alpha bloodlines, where the king was not just a political title but a physical reality, a man whose wolf was said to be large enough to pull down a horse and whose authority was enforced not just by armies but by something older and more primal. A kingdom that had 15 years ago suffered a devastating betrayal at the hands of Durnhold's crown. Lysara knew that story. She had found it in the restricted archive when she was 16. A sealed file, dusty with age, buried under years of administrative documents her father had never expected anyone to read. The account was clinical on its surface, but the facts it contained were not clinical at all. A diplomatic summit, a negotiated peace, a queen of Ironvale who had come to Durnhold in good faith to formalize a treaty. And a trap. Her father's trap, though the documents were careful to never use that word. The Ironvale queen had been killed. Her young son had escaped, and her husband, the Ironvale king at the time, had died 3 years later of what the documents called grief, which was a gentler word than what it actually was. That boy who had escaped was now the Alpha King of Ironvale. His name was Kalor Draven. Lysara had been thinking about that name since she was 16. She was assigned, without ceremony or suspicion, to the 3rd Forward Company of the Durnhold 2nd Army, a unit of roughly 200 soldiers being moved toward the northern border where the initial engagement was expected. Her commanding officer was a heavy-set man named Captain Torlin, who smelled of pipe smoke and made no eye contact with new recruits, which suited her perfectly. She was logged as Syl Varen, junior infantry, age 19, placed in a tent with 7 other soldiers, and told that they would march in the morning. The soldiers in her unit were, in her estimation, a mixed collection of human uncertainty presented in military uniform. There was Davin, 17 and terrified and working very hard not to show it, who talked constantly about his mother's farm. There was Rek, 30-ish and weathered, who had done this before and showed it in the way he moved. Economical, unhurried, already conserving energy for what was coming. There was a pair of brothers whose names she never properly caught, who communicated largely through glances and seemed to have no particular opinions about anything. And then there was Marin. Marin was 23, sharp-tongued, and had noticed Lysara on the first night with the particular attentiveness of someone who was also hiding something and therefore more alert to the signs in others. "You've got soft hands," Marin said, the second night, while they were sharpening blades by lantern light. Lysara kept her eyes on her sword. "I grew up in a village. My mother ran a weaving house." "Weaving," Marin repeated. "Yes. You move like someone who was trained to fight." "My mother had opinions about self-defense." Marin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother had opinions about self-defense too. Mine got me as far as the army recruiting station in Coalbridge and no further." She paused. "I'm not asking questions. I'm just saying, whatever you're running from, you picked an interesting direction to run." Lysara looked up at her then. Marin's face in the lantern light was square-jawed and calm, carrying that particular expression of someone who has made peace with uncertainty. "I'm not running from something," Lysara said. "I'm running towards something." Marin considered that. Does the something know you're coming? No, Lysara said. Marin almost smiled. Usually more interesting that way. They marched for 4 days through cold autumn terrain. Gray skies, muddy roads, the smell of wood smoke from villages they passed that watched them with the flat, measuring eyes of people who have learned to assess armies the way farmers assess weather. Not with fear or excitement, but with the steady calculation of someone deciding how to prepare for what's coming. Lysara walked and listened and watched. She had not come here without a plan. She had not, in truth, come here entirely for herself, though escaping the marriage contract had been the immediate trigger. She had come here because the war between Durnhold and Ironvale was connected to the files she had found in her father's archive when she was 16, and she had spent 3 years since then slowly, carefully understanding the shape of what her father had done. The murder of Ironvale's queen, the deliberate destabilization of a peace treaty, the cultivation of the current conflict through years of manufactured provocations, trade disputes arranged to appear organic, border incidents staged by Durnhold agents and blamed on Ironvale, a slow poisoning of any possibility of diplomatic resolution. Her father was not at war with Ironvale because Ironvale had wronged him. He was at war with Ironvale because he was afraid. Afraid specifically of Alpha King Kaelor Draven, a man who had grown up watching his mother die and had spent every year since building himself into something her father could not easily neutralize through political maneuvering. A man whose grief had been converted, over 15 years, into something that looked like a kingdom, but functioned more like a weapon. Lysara did not know what she intended to do when she reached that man. She had a shape of an idea, an admission, evidence she had gathered from the archive, the possibility of a different kind of resolution. She knew it was incomplete. She knew the circumstances were unpredictable. She also knew that whatever happened on this battlefield would shape the next generation of both kingdoms, and she was not willing to let it happen without her. The battle began at dawn on the 5th day, in a valley called the Ashford Crossing. She heard it before she saw it, a low, building sound like the sky itself beginning to tear, the percussion of thousands of feet, and the higher discordant note of weapons already in motion. The 3rd Forward Company was positioned at the left flank, which their captain explained meant they would hold the line while the main force engaged at the center. He said this in the manner of a man explaining something straightforward, and Lysara noted the careful absence of information about what they were supposed to do if the center didn't hold. She stood in formation with the others and watched the valley below fill with movement. The Ironvale forces were not what she had expected, and she had expected something considerable. They came down from the high ground in organized formations, but the discipline of their movement was underlaid with something she had no word for. A sense of contained power, like watching a river that appeared calm but carried enormous force beneath the surface. Their soldiers were tall and moved in the particular way of people who had been training since childhood and at their flanks. At the far edges of her vision, she could make out shapes that were not entirely human. Shifters. She had known they were real. She had read about them. Reading and seeing, she now understood, were not the same thing. "Left flank! Advance!" Captain Torlin's voice carried over the noise. And then there was no more time to think. She fought for 4 hours. Later, she would not be able to reconstruct those 4 hours with any kind of narrative coherence. They came back to her only in fragments, in the way that extreme experience tends to exist in memory. Not as a sequence, but as a collection of vivid, disconnected images with no clean lines between them. Daven, 3 feet to her left, moving his shield arm faster than she would have expected from someone so frightened. A soldier she didn't recognize stumbling into her from behind, and the reflex of bracing that kept her upright. A Ironvale warrior twice her size, and the 3 seconds of calculation that followed, and the sound of her blade connecting and the fact that she kept moving. Marin, somewhere in the chaos, who she could track occasionally by the sound of her voice. A specific, identifiable quality of focus that cut through the general noise. Rek, who had been right that experience was worth more than size, and who she had lost sight of at some point and did not see again. She fought the way Ren had trained her, without elegance, without wasted motion, attending to the immediate 3 feet of space around her and not looking further than that, because looking further than that in a battle was how people died. She was not the best fighter in the 3rd Forward Company. She was probably somewhere in the middle, by technical standard, But she had three things that the middle third of most units didn't. She was calm when others weren't. She was reading the field constantly, even while engaged in it. And she had been told, and believed, that the ability to not show pain was worth more than most other skills. She showed none of the pain when the blow came. It came from her left. An Iron Veil soldier, young, better than she'd been tracking, whose strike got through her guard in the moment when her attention had been split between him and a second opponent at her right. The impact hit her left side below the ribs, going through the gap where the armor plates joined. Not a killing strike, but significant. She felt the wet heat of it before the pain arrived, which was how she knew it was serious. She stepped back, managed two more exchanges with the first opponent before her left leg buckled. She went down. The ground was cold. The noise of the battle was very loud and then, strangely, quieter. The way extreme pain sometimes narrows perception to just the interior, just the body's immediate experience. She lay still. Around her, the battle shifted and moved, and eventually, by degrees that she measured in the quality of the noise above her, began to recede. The cold beneath her became more present than the pain in her side. She kept her breathing shallow and steady and concentrated on remaining conscious, which was, she recognized with the specific clarity of someone in serious trouble, not guaranteed. Chud. The Ashford crossing fell quiet in the way that only battlefields fall quiet. A horrible, total stillness that was the opposite of peace, because stillness in a place where thousands of people had been moving was its own kind of violence. She heard, eventually, the sound of footsteps. Not panicked footsteps, not retreating footsteps. These were the deliberate, measured footsteps of someone who was moving through the field with a purpose, checking the fallen, she understood. Looking for survivors or for enemies still capable of causing damage, or both. She did not move. The footsteps came closer. A long pause. Someone crouching near her. Then a hand at her neck. Checking for a pulse, she understood, the way a trained soldier checks. And the moment the fingers touched her skin, she felt something entirely outside of her experience and entirely outside of what she had any framework to explain. It was like, she would spend months afterwards struggling to describe this, like a current of something traveling from that point of contact outward through her entire body simultaneously. Not pain, not warmth exactly, though warmth was the closest physical analogy. Something older than either of those things. Something that moved through her like recognition, though she had never met this person and didn't know his touch or his presence or the sound of his breathing. She opened her eyes. She was looking up at the gray autumn sky, pale cloud, colorless light, and then the sky was blocked by a face. She had a confused, fractured impression of it before the world tilted. Dark hair plastered down by rain, a jaw set hard as quarried stone, eyes the color of deep winter ice, pale gray, almost silver, and burning with something she could not name. He was not young, but not old. He was very large. He wore the armor of an enemy commander. He was staring at her, and she understood, in the part of her mind that was still functioning clearly beneath the pain and blood loss and cold, that he had not been expecting what he found. His mouth opened, said something. She didn't catch the words. The world went dark. She had one more moment of consciousness before it went entirely. A lurch of awareness, sensation of being lifted, the smell of iron and rain, and something else beneath that, something she would later identify as pine and smoke, and the specific mineral scent of old stone, like the smell of a castle that had stood for centuries. She thought, I didn't get to tell him anything. She thought, not yet, and then nothing. Somewhere, above the gray valley of Ashford Crossing, above the cold mud and the fallen weapons and the terrible quiet of a battlefield settling into its aftermath, a wolf howled once, long and low and resonant, the sound moving through the air like a declaration made to no particular audience, witnessed only by the colorless sky. The soldiers who heard it stopped what they were doing for a moment. None of them had ever heard the Alpha King's wolf make that sound before. It was not a victory call. It was something much older and more complicated than victory. She came back to consciousness the way a person drowns in reverse, slowly, reluctantly, biting upward through layers of dark water toward a surface that kept receding every time she reached for it. The first thing she registered was warmth. not the wet, uncertain warmth of her own body heat conserved under a wool blanket in a field camp. Something more substantial than that, a stone-built warmth, the kind that comes from walls thick enough to hold heat through the night, from a fire that had been burning for hours in an enclosed space. It surrounded her with an almost physical weight, pressing in from all sides like the warmth was itself a presence. The second thing she registered was pain. Her left side, where the blow had landed, but changed now from the acute tearing pain of the initial wound into something deeper and duller, a slow, persistent throb that she recognized from Ren's lessons as the pain of a wound that had been treated and was working, sutured probably, cleaned. She cataloged it carefully, significant but not worsening, which meant no infection yet, which meant she had at least a window. The third thing she registered was that she was not alone in the room. She kept her eyes closed for 3 more breaths, measuring, listening. She could hear another person breathing, seated from the sound of it, not standing, somewhere to her right and slightly elevated, which suggested a chair rather than a floor position. The breathing was steady and controlled, the breathing of someone who was alert but not agitated, someone who had been waiting. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was stone, arched, fitted with iron sconces that held candles burning down to their lower thirds, which told her it was late, several hours after nightfall at minimum. She was on a bed. A real bed, not a cot. A wide, solid thing with a frame she could feel beneath the mattress, covered in coarse wool blankets that smelled of cedar and smoke. She turned her head. He was sitting in a high-backed chair 3 feet from the bed, forearms resting on his knees, watching her with an expression she could not immediately classify. The armor was gone. He wore a plain dark shirt with the sleeves pushed back to the elbows, and there was dried blood on his left forearm that didn't appear to be his. He was larger than she'd processed in those fractured moments on the battlefield. Not just tall, but built in the way of someone whose size had been forged rather than inherited. The kind of physical reality that comes from a lifetime of training and use and the specific demands placed on a body by a wolf that lived inside it. His eyes were exactly as she'd remembered in those last confused seconds before she'd lost consciousness. Pale silver gray, burning. He said, "You're awake." His voice was lower than she'd expected. Not a performance of authority, just a natural register that carried the same quality as his eyes. A banked intensity, something running underneath the surface that didn't need to announce itself. "Apparently," she said. Her own voice came out rougher than she intended. Dry throat, blood loss, the residue of hours in cold rain, and she pushed herself carefully up to a seated position, monitoring her side as she moved. The wound pulled, but held. She was wearing a plain linen shirt that wasn't hers, and her legs were covered by the blankets. Someone had removed her armor and bound her wound and put her in dry clothes. The realization of the logistics of that landed on her with a particular kind of weight. "Who treated the wound?" she asked. "My healer," he said. "Physician by trade. The best in Ironvale." "How long was I unconscious?" 11 hours. She processed that, looked around the room. Stone walls, one door, one window with heavy shutters drawn, iron candle holders, no visible weapons within immediate reach. His chair was positioned between her and the door. Not aggressively, she decided. There was no performance of blocking in it, but it was not accidental either. "Where am I?" she asked, though she thought she already knew. "Iron Vale," he said. "Greyspire Keep, my eastern stronghold." She looked at him. He was looking at her with the same contained attention he'd been giving her since she opened her eyes, as if he was waiting for something specific from her, a reaction or a particular kind of information. "You brought me across the border," she said. "Yes." "Why?" The question sat between them. He was quiet for a moment. A deliberate quiet, she understood, not a hesitant one. The quiet of someone who is choosing their words precisely. "I didn't decide to," he said finally. "I want you to understand that. It was not a decision I made." She studied his face. "Then what was it?" His jaw tightened. "Something I'll explain when you're not bleeding through your dressings." She looked down. There was a faint dark patch spreading through the linen over her left side. Not rapidly, not alarmingly, but present. She'd moved too quickly sitting up. Lie back, he said. I'm fine. You're reopening the sutures. He stood from the chair, and the movement had that quality she'd noticed in his soldiers on the battlefield. Economical, no wasted motion, a body that knew exactly what it was doing at all times. He crossed to the bed and held out his hand. Let me look. She did not lie back. She looked at his outstretched hand instead. You're the Alpha King of Ironvale, she said. Yes. And I'm a soldier of the Durnhold army. Yes. So why, she said carefully, are you offering to personally check my wound? The question clearly landed. His expression did something complicated. A fractional tightening around his eyes, a tension in his jaw that looked like the pressure of containing something larger than he intended to show. He lowered his hand slowly. Lie back, he said again, quieter this time, and I'll tell you what I know. She lay back, not because she trusted him, she was nowhere near trusting him yet, but because the alternative was bleeding into the mattress while refusing on principle, which was a poor tactical position. She watched him from beneath lowered lashes as he examined the bandaging, his hands careful and impersonal, with a practiced efficiency that confirmed what he'd said about his healer. Whoever had treated her had known what they were doing, and he had been watching closely enough to replicate the technique. It's not serious, he said, adjusting the binding with a precision that surprised her. You need to stop moving like you're not injured. Occupational difficulty, she said. He almost reacted to that. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite what she would call a smile. He sat back on the edge of the chair. I went on to the field after the engagement, he said, to check the fallen. My officers do it. I do it too. It matters to me that it's done. She waited. I found you? He paused. When I checked for a pulse. Another pause, longer. You felt it too. It was not a question. She had been rehearsing what to do with this moment since the second time she'd woken up on the way to consciousness and remembered what had happened. She'd run through her options: denial, deflection, clinical acknowledgement, the various postures a person could take when confronted with something they didn't have a framework for. She'd arrived in those 11 hours of unconsciousness at something that felt like a conclusion, though a deeply uncomfortable one. Yes, she said. He looked at her. The silver-gray eyes were very still. You know what it is? I've read about it, she said. The shifter bond. I didn't know enough to know if what I read was accurate. It's accurate? His voice was flat. It's real, and it doesn't... He stopped, started again. It doesn't care about timing, or circumstances, or whether it makes any sense. No, she agreed. I gathered that. Silence. A log shifted in the fireplace somewhere beyond her sightline, sending up a brief cascade of sparks. I need to know who you are, he said. Her chest tightened. I told you. I'm Syl Varen, 3rd Forward Company. No, he said, simply, without heat. You're not. She looked at him. My wolf knows a great deal of things without being told, he said. It's not pleasant, always. But it's rarely wrong. He leaned forward slightly. The tags around your neck say one name. The way you hold yourself says another. You were trained in a way that doesn't match a junior infantry recruit from a border village. He paused. And the crest on your armor, she felt the blood leave her face. Before my people removed it, he continued, was partially obscured, but not entirely. He watched her. The golden-gray diagonal, House Varen. The room was very quiet. I want you to tell me yourself, he said. Not because I need confirmation, because I want to hear you say it. She made a decision in the space of 2 seconds. Not a small decision. She understood the weight of it precisely. She could continue the performance. She was good enough at it to hold for a while longer, possibly, though his intelligence people would eventually produce the same conclusion his wolf already had. She could perform Syl Varen for as long as the performance would hold and hope that time bought her something. Or she could stop. Lysara, she said. My name is Lysara Varen, Princess of Durnhold, first daughter of King Aldrich. She held his gaze. And I have information about your mother's death that your father never received because it was buried in a sealed file in the Durnholdy Palace archive. And I spent 3 years copying it, and I have it in the pack that your people brought here with my armor." The silence after that was extraordinary. Kaelor Draven did not move for 5 full seconds. His expression did not change exactly, but something behind his eyes shifted in the way that deep water shifts when something large moves through it, not visible on the surface, present nonetheless. "My mother," he said. "Yes. You—" He stopped, started again. "You have documentation." 43 pages, she said. "Copies. The originals are still in the archive. It details the planning and execution of the ambush at the Peace Summit. It names every person involved. It includes correspondence from my father to his intelligence chief that makes the intention explicit." She paused. "I know why you want to destroy Durnhold. I know what Durnhold did to deserve it. And I came here. I came here because I wanted you to have the truth before the war went any further." He stood up from the chair. He walked away from her, to the window, to the shuttered dark, and stood there with his back to her and his hands loose at his sides. His breathing had changed. She could hear it from across the room. Deeper, less controlled, working to stay steady. She waited. "Why?" he said without turning. "Would the daughter of Aldrich Varen carry evidence against her own father onto a battlefield?" "Because he's my father," she said, "not my king. And because what he did was wrong, and I have known it was wrong since I was 16 years old, and I am finished being used as a piece in his game while he keeps building toward a war that will kill thousands of people to protect a lie he has been living for 15 years. Silence. "And," she added, because she had decided to be entirely honest and she was going to see it through, "because he was going to marry me off to a man I'd never met in order to buy himself a fleet of ships, and I had other ideas about my life." He turned around then. He looked at her from across the room, this large, controlled, dangerous man who had been carrying grief like a second skeleton since he was a child, and his expression was something she did not have a word for. "You walked onto a battlefield," he said slowly, "in enemy uniform, carrying 43 pages of evidence against your own father, with a wound in your side that should have killed you, to give documents to the man who has sworn to destroy your bloodline." "When you say it like that," she said, "it sounds less strategic than I intended." Something happened to his face. It was brief and appeared involuntary, a fraction of something that was absolutely not appropriate to the circumstances and that he visibly worked to contain. He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and turned back to the window. "You need to sleep," he said, his voice back under control. "We'll talk in the morning." "The pack," she said, "with the documents, it's here. It hasn't been touched." He moved toward the door. "My physician will check the wound again at dawn. Don't remove the binding." "Kaelor." He stopped. It was the first time she had said his name. She watched the effect of it move through the line of his shoulders. A subtle tension, there and gone. "I'm not your enemy," she said. He was very still for a moment. "I know," he said. He closed the door behind him. Mom. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark of a stone room in the enemy king's eastern stronghold and ran calculations with the focused precision of someone who had been preparing for this particular kind of problem for years. She was inside Ironvale, injured, without her armor, in the custody of a man whose claim on her was complicated in ways she was still processing. Her father did not yet know where she was. He would know she was missing, certainly, but whether he knew she had crossed into Ironvale was unclear. His intelligence people would be working. The documents were intact. She had confirmed that. 43 pages of carefully copied evidence that represented 3 years of careful work and considerable personal risk. She had removed files from the restricted archive in single pages, copied them by hand in her room in the small hours of the morning, and returned each original within 48 hours so that the absence pattern would not register. It had taken her 14 months to complete. Those pages were, she believed, the most important thing in the room. They were also, she was aware, the most dangerous. Because when the contents of those pages became known, when the full scope of what Aldrich Varen had done to the Iron Vale royal family was laid out with documentation and names and explicit correspondence, it would not diminish the war. It would transform it. The character of the conflict would change entirely. She needed Kaelor to understand that. She needed him to understand it quickly, before the information spread in a form he didn't control. She fell asleep with that calculation still running, her hand resting near the edge of the bed where she had established, in her initial inventory of the room, that there was nothing within reach she could use as a weapon if she needed to. She found, in some corner of herself that she couldn't quite account for, that this bothered her less than it should. The morning arrived gray and cold through the gap at the edge of the shutters, and with it came Kaelor's physician, a compact silver-haired woman named Selah, who had the efficient manner of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had no patience left for anything that wasn't directly relevant to the task. She checked the wound with brisk, impersonal competence, pronounced the sutures intact, changed the dressing with a minimum of conversation, and left. Kaelor arrived 20 minutes later. He had slept, she could tell by the quality of his stillness, more settled than the night before, and he was carrying 2 cups of something hot that he set on the table near the bed without ceremony. He sat in the same chair. He had the pack with her documents in his hand. "I looked through it last night," he said. She straightened. "Without telling me?" "It was in my keep," he said. "Everything in my keep is mine to examine." He looked at her. "Did you expect otherwise?" She considered. "No, but I would have liked to be present." "I know." He set the pack on the table. "I read all 43 pages. She waited. His face was composed in the way of someone who had spent the night processing something large and had arrived, by morning, at a controlled position. But she was learning already, and this surprised her, how quickly she was learning the landscape of his expression, that the control was the surface and not the substance. Beneath it, something was still burning. "The name on page 31, he said. "Harvin, my father's advisor. He was at the summit." "He was also on my father's payroll," she said, "since the year before. It's in the correspondence on pages 34 through 37. He looked at her. "Harvin died 8 years ago." "Yes." "Conveniently. My father's people were thorough," she said. "The ones who could confirm direct complicity didn't tend to survive it. But the paper trail was left intact because my father assumed no one would ever—" She paused. "He underestimated the possibility of someone actually looking, because he assumed his own daughter would never go looking." "He assumed I was decorative," she said. "He was wrong." Kaelor looked at the pack on the table for a long moment. "What do you want me to do with this?" "I want you to use it," she said, "in whatever way serves the best outcome for the most people." "And what do you think that is?" She looked at him steadily. "I think you have spent 15 years building toward destroying Durnhold. I think you have the right to that anger, and I'm not asking you to set it down. But I think there's a difference between destroying the king who did this to your family and destroying the kingdom full of people who didn't." Silence. "I know you know that," she added. "I'm not telling you something new. I'm telling you that I came here because I think there's a version of this that ends differently, and I want to be part of making that happen." He looked at her for a long time. The silver-gray eyes moved across her face in a way that felt like reading. Careful, thorough, looking for what was behind the words rather than just the words themselves. "You're asking me to trust you," he said. "I'm asking you to consider that I came here carrying evidence against my own father and climbed onto a battlefield to do it," she said. "I'm asking you to weight that appropriately." He stood up from the chair. He walked to the window. She was beginning to understand that the window was where he went when he needed space to think, and opened the shutters a hand's width. Cold air came in, carrying the smell of pine and stone and the particular clean edge of high-elevation morning. "There's a complication," he said. She had expected something. "Tell me." "My counsel knows you're here." He turned from the window. "Not your identity. Not yet. They know I brought back a Durnhold soldier. They're—" He paused. "Not pleased? What does your counsel believe should happen to Durnhold prisoners?" "My counsel," he said carefully, has a range of opinions. Some of them are more moderate than others. And the less moderate ones? Think that the appropriate response to a Durnhold soldier inside Iron Vale's borders is a public execution. His voice was completely flat, which she was learning meant the emotion underneath was significant. As a statement about where this war is going. She absorbed this. And what did you tell them? That the prisoner was being held pending my assessment, and that my assessment was ongoing. He looked at her. That bought approximately 48 hours before they start asking questions I'll need to have answers for. 48 hours, she repeated, to decide what story they're told. And how. He paused. Your identity cannot come out yet. If they know you're Aldrich Varen's daughter, the calls for execution become... He stopped. The political pressure would be significant. You're saying your own council would pressure you to execute the daughter of your enemy. I'm saying that there are members of my council who lost people at the peace summit 15 years ago, he said quietly, that the name Varen carries a specific weight in this kingdom, and that you being here, carrying that name, in my keep, he stopped again. Complicates things, she finished, considerably. She looked at her hands, bare, the calluses from 2 years of sword training visible on the palms, the pearl bracelet still on her left wrist because no one had removed it. She thought about 48 hours. She thought about 43 pages of documents on a table 3 feet away from her. She thought about her father, who by now certainly knew she was missing, and was probably already mobilizing to find her. I need to be useful to you, she said, not as a prisoner, as something that has agency. She looked up at him. If I'm a prisoner, I'm a problem for you to manage. If I'm a... She searched for the right word. A partner in this? I'm a resource. A partner, he said. The word clearly landed with some weight. I know Durnhold's military strategy, she said. I know my father's council structure. I know his weaknesses, his intelligence sources, his supply chains, his political alliances, and which of them are fragile. I have been paying attention in that palace since I was 14 years old, and I remember everything. She held his gaze. I am not asking you to trust me emotionally. I am telling you that I am more useful as a collaborator than as a cell. He looked at her for a long moment. The burning in his eyes was doing something complicated. What is Durnhold's western supply route? He said. Flat, immediate, a test. 2 roads, she said without hesitation. The main road through Halverton, which carries roughly 70% of military supply, and the river path through the Greyfen marshes, which is slower but harder to intercept and carries the high-value cargo. Medical supplies, officer equipment, intelligence dispatch. She paused. The Greyfen path has a single guard post at the river's first fork that is staffed by 6 people and changes shift at midday. It's been that way for 11 years. Silence. My father thinks it's secure because no one knows about it, she said. He's wrong. I know about it. And now you do. Kaelor was very still. Then, slowly, he crossed back to the chair and sat down. He picked up the cup of something hot that had been sitting on the table, looked at it, set it back down. My council meeting is in 4 hours, he said. I need a story that holds. That tell them I'm an intelligence asset, she said. A Durnhold soldier who offered information in exchange for medical treatment. It's close enough to true that it'll hold under questioning, and it gives me a status that isn't execution. He looked at her. You've done this before. Constructed cover stories? Thought 3 moves ahead. I've had a great deal of practice, she said, growing up in a court where everyone is perpetually maneuvering. It turns out to be useful outside of courts, too. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, The council meeting, you'll need to stay in this room. I understand. My people will bring you food. Don't open the door for anyone who doesn't knock twice. And if someone knocks twice who shouldn't, then you make sure they regret it, he said. He stood. He was almost at the door when he turned. The pack. Keep it, she said. You need to understand everything in it before the council meeting. I'll explain anything that's unclear. He held her gaze for a moment. There's a passage on page 9, he said. A meeting between your father and his intelligence chief, 2 weeks before the summit. There's a section that's... The handwriting changes mid-line. That section was added later, she said quietly. After the fact. The original document ended before that line. The edition is in a different ink. You'd need to compare it with the original, but I believe it was fabricated. Someone added language after the summit to make the order appear more ambiguous than it was. My father covering himself. His jaw was very tight. The unaltered sections are damning enough, she said. I'm sorry. Don't apologize to me, he said. Not for things you didn't do. He left. She sat in the quiet of the stone room and listened to his footsteps recede down the corridor. Slow, deliberate. The footsteps of a man carrying something very heavy and determined not to let it show in his walk. Outside the shuttered window, the wind moved through the pine trees around Grayspire Keep with a sound like water. She picked up the cup he'd left, tea, she found, gone cool but still present, and wrapped both hands around it and sat very still, running calculations. 48 hours. Her father's intelligence people had a maximum range of 72 hours before they could produce a probable location for her with the assets available. She knew this because she had spent 2 years mapping his intelligence network along with everything else. She had a 72-hour window before Aldrich Varen knew exactly where his daughter was and began making decisions about what to do about it. She thought about what those decisions would look like. She thought about the look on Kaler's face when she'd told him about page 31, and the way the burning behind his eyes had shifted into something that was not quite what she would call grief, and not quite what she would call fury, but contained elements of both. She thought about a 15-year-old boy escaping from a burning peace summit with the knowledge of what had just been done to his family. She set down the cup. Whatever was coming in the next 48 hours, she needed to be ready for it. She needed to be clear-headed and functional and useful, which meant she needed to eat something and move around enough to understand the full current state of her injury, and she needed to stop spending time on things she couldn't change and focus entirely on the variables she could still influence. She stood up from the bed, carefully, monitoring her side. The wound pulled. She breathed through it. She stayed upright. Good enough. She crossed to the window and opened the shutters. Not wide, just enough to look out. And what she saw was Grayspire Keep's outer courtyard, 3 stories below, where 20 or 30 soldiers were moving in the morning in various states of training and preparation and the ordinary business of a military stronghold. At the far edge of the courtyard, half obscured by the angle of the wall, she could see the figure of a large man standing at the parapet, looking out toward the valley. He was not moving. He was standing with the stillness of someone who has found the one point in the world where they can be completely alone with what's inside them. And he was letting himself have exactly that for exactly as long as he could afford. She understood that posture. She closed the shutters. She sat back down on the bed and waited for what was coming, with the particular steadiness of a woman who had decided years ago in a cold training yard that whatever was ahead of her was preferable to whatever was behind. The fire in the room burned down to coals. Outside, somewhere in the pines, the wind continued its long, indifferent conversation with the stone walls of Ironvale's eastern keep. And somewhere in the corridors below, a king was preparing to walk into a room full of people who wanted answers, carrying the weight of 15 years of grief and 43 pages of truth, and figure out how to hold the line for 48 more hours. Neither of them knew yet that their window was already closing. 300 miles to the west, in the palace at Durnhold, a man with cold eyes and a court full of advisors had already narrowed the location of his missing daughter to a 40-mile radius. And he was not sending diplomats. That fact settled into the stone walls of Grayspire Keep sometime around midday, carried not by messenger or raven, but by the particular quality of silence that descends on a military intelligence operation when the news arriving is bad enough that the men carrying it slow their steps without realizing they're doing it. Lysara heard the change before she was told anything. She had spent the morning doing what she could within the confines of the room, moving carefully, testing the wound's tolerance, cataloging the space with methodical attention, because a room you understand completely is a room that cannot surprise you. She had located 2 objects that could function as weapons if required: a heavy iron candle holder near the window and a small carving knife left on the food tray that morning, which she had moved under the edge of the mattress with the unhurried ease of someone making a routine adjustment to their bedding. She had examined the window drop. 3 stories, survivable under optimal conditions, not survivable in her current state. She had established that the door lock was exterior only, which meant she could not secure herself in, and anyone with a key could enter without warning. She had been working through contingencies when she heard the footsteps in the corridor change pitch. Not Kaylor's footsteps. She had already learned those, the particular measured weight of them. These were shorter, faster, carrying urgency without quite tipping into panic. Multiple sets. Stopping outside her door. 2 knocks. She was on her feet before the door opened, her hand near the mattress edge, her weight balanced the way Wren had taught her, low center, ready to move in any direction. Kaylor came in. Behind him, a man she hadn't seen before, younger, sharp-featured, wearing the insignia of a military intelligence officer. Both of them carried the expression of people who have just received information that has changed the shape of what they're dealing with. "Sit down," Kaylor said. "Tell me first." He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. A flicker of what might have been respect, quickly absorbed back into the larger expression of controlled urgency. "Your father's army is moving, not toward Ashford Crossing, directly toward this position." The room was very still. "How many?" she asked. "Our scouts counted 3 battalions," the intelligence officer said. His name, she would learn shortly, was Cavan. 3rd son of a border lord, 28 years old, and possessed of the specific kind of sharpness that comes from growing up in a family where intelligence work was considered a higher calling than military command. Approximately 4,000 soldiers, moving fast. They've abandoned the supply train, just soldiers, weapons, and horses. "That's not a military campaign," she said. "That's an extraction." "Yes," Kaylor said. "He knows I'm here." "We have to assume so." She sat down then, not because he'd told her to, but because she needed a moment to recalibrate, and the wound in her side was making standing without support increasingly costly. She pressed her hand against her ribs and ran the numbers. 4,000 soldiers moving at extraction pace, abandoning supply lines, targeting a specific location rather than a strategic objective. "He's not here for the war," she said. "He's here for me. And for—" She stopped. "The documents," Kaylor said. She looked up at him. "He knows about the documents," she said. Not a question. "A rider came in an hour ago, intercepted Durenholde dispatch, coded, but our people broke it in 40 minutes. Cavan set a folded paper on the table. She could see the blocky ciphertext with handwritten translation below. The dispatch refers to the archive material and the Varine girl in the same sentence. "Whoever your father's intelligence people are, they've connected them." She stared at the dispatch. "He doesn't know the contents," she said slowly. "If he knew the full contents, the dispatch would read differently. He knows I took something from the archive. He doesn't know how much." "Does it matter?" Cavan asked. "Yes," she said. "If he knows the full scope of what I copied, he's coming here to destroy the documents and eliminate every person who's read them. If he only knows I took something, he's coming here because I'm his daughter, and I ran away and he wants me back under control." She looked at Kaylor. The response in each case is different. Kaylor was watching her with that careful reading the room attention. "Which do you think it is?" "I think it's both," she said. "I think he started with wanting me back, and then his people told him about the archive, and now he wants both things at once, and he's moving fast enough that he hasn't fully thought through the fact that those 2 objectives are in conflict." Silence. Cavan looked at Kaylor. Kaylor was looking at Lysara. "The council meeting," Kaylor said. "It has to happen now. Not in 4 hours. Now." "Then you need to tell them who I am." "Yes." She held his gaze. "How bad is that going to be?" He was very quiet for a moment. "The council has 11 members. 4 of them lost direct family at the Peace Summit 15 years ago. 2 of those 4 are significant voices. When they hear your name, they'll want me dead," she said. He didn't deny it. "They'll want something I won't give them," he said. The quiet between those 2 sentences was substantial. "Kaylor," she said carefully, "you can't protect me at the cost of your council's loyalty, not with 4,000 soldiers 3 days away." "I'm aware of the geometry," he said. "Then you know that I need to be in that room." Both men looked at her. "You need to be in that room," she repeated. Not hidden in a stone room 3 floors up while your council debates my fate without looking at my face. I need to be present. I need to speak. She watched Kaylor's expression. If I'm a category to them, the Varin girl, the Durnhold princess, the enemy, then I can be disposed of in the abstract. If I'm a person standing in front of them with 43 pages of evidence on the table and a wound in my side from a battle I fought in their valley, it's harder. It's also significantly more dangerous for you, Cavan said. I know. Some of those council members carry weapons as a matter of habit, he continued, and their feelings about the name Varin are, I know, she said again. I'm asking to go anyway. Another long look between the two men. She's right, Cavan said, quietly, to Kaylor. Kaylor looked at her for a moment that stretched and compressed at the same time, the way moments do when they're carrying more weight than their length suggests. Then he said, You walk in with me. You don't speak until I give you an opening, and if any of them move toward you, you won't need to intervene, she said. I know I won't, he said. That's not why I'm saying it. He held her gaze with an intensity that had a specific quality she was still learning to read, something that was protective and frustrated, and something else underneath both. I'm saying it because I want you to know that if they move toward you, I'll be between them and you before they take a second step. So don't factor that into your calculations as a variable. It's a constant. The room was very quiet. All right, she said. The council chamber of Greyspire Keep was a long, low-ceilinged room built for function rather than impression. None of the theatrical architecture of Durnhold's strategy halls, none of the decorative stone and high windows designed to make visitors feel small. This room was just stone and oak and the specific accumulated weight of hard decisions made inside it over many years. A long table, 11 chairs, maps pinned to the walls with iron tacks, the smell of wood smoke and old paper, and the barely perceptible undercurrent of wolf. The ambient presence of 11 shifters in an enclosed space, a thing she noticed at the back of her throat like a change in barometric pressure. They were already assembled when she walked in with Kaylor. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Not all of them recognized her. She could see the confusion in several faces, the calculation, the attempt to place an unfamiliar face in an unexpected context. But the 4 who had lost people at the summit, she identified them instantly because their reactions were not confusion. Their reactions were recognition of a different and much colder kind. The one who stood was a woman in her 50s named Counselor Brennan. Lysara learned the name a moment later from the way Kaylor acknowledged her. She was broad-shouldered and gray-haired, and she stood from her chair with the contained deliberateness of someone who is working very hard not to do what their instincts are telling them to do. That is a Durnhold crest, Brennan said. Her voice was steady and absolute. On the shirt, that is a Durnhold royal crest. Sit down, Brennan, Kaylor said. His voice was quiet, which in a room like this, Lysara understood, meant more than if he'd raised it. Where did you find that girl? Brennan said. And the word girl carried a specific weight that was not diminutive, was not dismissive, was instead the weight of a person who knows exactly what they're looking at and is trying to determine what it means. Ashford Crossing, Kaylor said. On the battlefield. She was wounded. He moved to the head of the table. Sit down, all of you. There is information you need, and we have a limited time window before I need your full military and strategic attention on an approaching problem. They sat. Not all of them quickly. Brennan last. Kaylor set the pack on the table. Her name is Lysara Varin, he said. She is the first princess of Durnhold. He held the room through the eruption that followed. It was brief, 3 or 4 seconds of overlapping voices and the sound of chairs scraping, with the particular authority that comes not from volume, but from the complete stillness of a person who is entirely confident they will be heard when they speak next. She came onto that battlefield deliberately. She has been in this keep for 18 hours. In that time, she has provided military intelligence about Durnhold's western supply route and given me 43 pages of copied archive documents that detail the planning of the Peace Summit ambush that killed my mother. The room went silent. Not the silence of people waiting to speak. The silence of people who have just had something large and unexpected move through them. Lysara stood beside the door, not backed against it, not in a defensive posture, standing with her feet at shoulder width and her hands loose at her sides and her face doing exactly what Ren had trained it to do, carrying precisely as much as she chose to show and nothing more. "She had these documents," said a man on the left side of the table. "Lord Commander Harwick." She catalogued him. Late 40s, military bearing, the look of someone who has spent 30 years making decisions under pressure and has the particular calm of a man who trusts his own judgment absolutely. "And she brought them here, voluntarily." "Yes," Kaylor said. "Why?" Kaylor looked at her, the opening she'd asked for. "Because the war your king has been building toward Durnhold for 15 years is pointed at the right target," she said. Every face in the room turned to her. She held the collective weight of 11 pairs of eyes without moving. "My father did what those documents say he did. He planned it, and he executed it, and he has been living inside that lie and building his kingdom on it for 15 years. Every diplomatic failure between your kingdom and mine for the last decade and a half has been engineered from his end. He has not wanted peace. He has wanted time to fortify, time to build alliances, time to maneuver himself into a position where the inevitable conflict would happen on his terms." She paused. "He has run out of time. And I am here because I would rather be in this room than in that palace when the accounting comes." Silence. "You are his daughter," Brennan said. Her voice was controlled with an effort that showed at the edges. "Yes." "You carry his blood. I also carry his archive," she said. "I choose what I carry." Brennan's jaw worked. "My husband died at that summit," she said. "My husband and my brother-in-law and a woman named Sarah, who had been my closest friend since childhood and who had been in service to the Iron Veil Queen for 8 years. She stopped. "They trusted the flag of peace. They walked into that hall believing—" She stopped again. "I know," Lysara said quietly. "I am not asking you to forgive what happened. I am not asking you to forgive me for who my father is. I am asking you to look at what I've brought here and consider what it means for what comes next." The room was very still. Then Lord Commander Harwick reached across the table and pulled the pack toward him. "Shasa." The council meeting lasted 2 hours. She stood for most of it. Sitting felt wrong in that room with those people, and her side was manageable as long as she breathed correctly. And she answered questions with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this particular interrogation for 3 years without knowing the specific audience. She knew Durnhold's structure and strategy and the level of detail that only someone who had been paying extremely close attention from inside it could provide. She knew the names of her father's intelligence chiefs and their methodologies. She knew the structure of his military council and the fault lines within it. She knew his financial arrangements with the coastal houses and the specific terms of the trade agreement that had been the immediate trigger for the current military escalation. She gave them all of it, not because she had decided to give them everything she knew regardless of circumstance. She was not naive enough to hand over her own leverage without understanding what she was getting in exchange. She gave them what she gave them because she understood, with the clarity of someone reading a room very carefully, that the value she provided in this meeting was the foundation of everything that came next. If she was useful here, she had a position. If she was not useful here, she was a problem. She was useful. By the end of the second hour, Harwick had the documents spread across the table and was cross-referencing them with maps and his own intelligence files with the focused attention of a man who had found a missing piece of a puzzle he'd been working on for years. 2 other council members had joined him. Brennan was still watching Lysara from across the table, still carrying that controlled fury, but the fury had shifted in character. It was no longer looking for a target. It was processing something. It was the intelligence officer's voice, Cavan, who had come into the council chamber quietly and taken a position near the wall, that broke the working quiet near the end of the second hour. "My lord," Cavan said to Kaylor, "the advanced scouts have updated the position report." Kaylor straightened. "How far?" "Closer than estimated. They're not taking the main road." Cavan paused. "They're using the Grafen Marsh path." Every person in the room went still. Lysara felt it a half-second before it arrived. The realization moving through her like cold water. The Grafen Marsh path, the route she had told Kaylor about that morning, the one her father used for high-value cargo, the one with the single guard post that changed shift at midday. He's not moving 4,000 soldiers through the marshes, Harwick said, half to himself. The terrain can't hold that many. Too slow, too exposed. Not 4,000, Cavan said. The 3 battalions are still on the main road, moving at standard pace, visible. He paused again. The marsh path has a smaller force, 40 soldiers, moving fast, no supply, no formation. The silence that followed had a specific quality that Lysara recognized from the moment in the council chamber when she'd first said her name. An extraction team, Kaelor said. A very good one, Cavan said. Our scouts almost missed them. They're using the marsh cover deliberately. Everyone looked at Lysara. He sent the 3 battalions first, she said slowly, working it through aloud because the thinking was faster that way. To draw your attention, to make you look at the main approach, while 40 specialists go through the path I shouldn't know about. She stopped. He knows. He knows I told you about it. How? Harwick said sharply. Because he knows me, she said. He knows what I took from the archive. He knows that if I'm here, I'm not here as a prisoner. I'm here talking. And he knows what I know about the marsh path because he's the one who told me about Durnhold's strategic infrastructure. Not directly, but I was in those meetings. She pressed her hand against her side. The wound was making itself known again, insistently. He's not sending 40 soldiers to fight their way in. He's sending 40 soldiers to get me out. And he sent them a path he knows I've already compromised, which means... She stopped. The room waited. Which means, she said, he doesn't care if I compromised it. He's using it anyway. Which means the 40 soldiers are not the point. They're the distraction inside the distraction. She looked at Kaelor. What's downstream of the marsh path? What does it give access to inside your border? Kaelor looked at Cavan. Cavan was already unrolling a map. The marsh path breaks into 3 tributaries at the second fork, Cavan said, tracing with his finger. First tributary leads to the valley approach. That's where your scouts would have seen them. Second tributary, he paused. Second tributary leads through to the base of Greyspire Ridge. Silence. There is no garrison on the ridge, Harwick said. His voice had gone flat in a way that carried its own alarm. No, Kaelor said. There's no garrison on the ridge because the ridge is considered inaccessible from the marsh side. The terrain is considered inaccessible, Lysara said. Not actually inaccessible. Considered. She looked around the room. My father has a man who grew up in the Grafen lowlands. He's been in service since before I was born. He knows every passable line through that terrain in conditions that would stop anyone else. She looked at Kaelor. His name is Osric. He's 62 years old and he looks like a court administrator, and he is the single most operationally dangerous person my father employs. You know this man, Kaelor said. I've been paying attention for 6 years, she said. Yes, I know him. Can he bring 40 soldiers up the ridge in the dark? She looked at him steadily. In the dark, in winter, probably half of them. But he doesn't need 40, he needs 3. Another silence. This one had edges. 3 people who reach the base of Greyspire in the dark, Harwick said. With access to the ridge, they can reach the keep walls. If they know the approach, Cavan said. Osric knows the approach, Lysara said. He's mapped every fortification my father has ever needed to breach or reinforce. He will have studied Greyspire. Kaelor turned to Harwick. Close the east gate. Full guard rotation on the ridge approach, double positions at the wall base, and I want the outer ward cleared of everyone who doesn't have a weapons assignment. He looked at Cavan. Track the marsh path force. I want their position updated every 15 minutes. Both men moved. The council was moving, the room converting from deliberative to operational with the fluid speed of people who had done this before. The maps being cleared to the walls, the documents gathered, the chairs pushed back. Brennan passed close to Lysara as she moved toward the door and stopped. She looked at her for a moment. Just a moment. This woman who had lost 3 people to a trap engineered by Lysara's father. This woman who had been working for 2 hours to contain what she felt and process what she knew. The documents, Brennan said. The original archive files, still in Durnhold? In the restricted archive on the palace's third level, Lysara said. Sealed under my father's personal cipher. The copies I made are the only full record outside those walls. Brennan held her gaze. When this is over, she said, I want the originals. So do I, Lysara said. Something moved across Brennan's face. Not warmth, not forgiveness, but something more complicated and perhaps more durable than either. The recognition of shared purpose, where the purpose itself was larger than either person carrying it. She nodded once and left the room. The keep at night was a different architecture. In daylight, Greyspire was functional and ordered, the movements of soldiers and staff following the patterns of a military installation that knew its own rhythms. In darkness, with a threat incoming, it converted into something else, tighter, more deliberate, every light and shadow acquiring a significance it hadn't held an hour before. Lysara moved through it with Kylor, both of them quiet, the corridor between the council chamber and the upper ward carrying the specific tension of a place that was holding its breath. You should go back to the room, he said. No. You're injured. You keep telling me that, she said. I keep doing things anyway. He stopped walking. She stopped a step later and turned to look at him. They were in a corridor lit by 2 torches mounted at intervals, the light catching the planes of his face in a way that made the tension there visible in sharp relief. If Osric gets to the walls, he started. If Osric gets to those walls, he's looking for me, she said. And a room 3 floors up with 1 door and no defenses is exactly where I should not be. She held his gaze. I know how Osric works. I know his priorities and his methods. I can be useful on the wall if it comes to that. With a wound in your side. With a wound in my side and a sword I'd like back, yes. He looked at her for a long moment. In the torchlight, his eyes were doing something complicated. That burning, that contained intensity, that particular quality of a man who is fighting something he doesn't entirely have words for. I don't... He stopped. Started again. I don't have a clean way to describe what I feel when I think about you being in danger, he said. I'm aware that it's not appropriate to the circumstances. I'm aware that you have been managing your own survival in circumstances considerably more complex than a fortified keep wall for several years, she offered. Several years, he agreed. I'm aware of all of that. He paused. I'm telling you anyway, because you asked me to be direct with you, and I intend to be. The bond is, it's not subtle, it is insistent, and it is specifically insistent on this point. The corridor was very quiet. Kylor, she said, I understand. I feel it too. She watched his face. But neither of us gets to be distracted right now. No, he said, we don't. So let's both be useful, and when this is over, he said, we will have an enormous number of things to discuss. Yes, she said, we will. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he said, your sword is in the east armory, 3rd rack from the door. He turned and kept walking. She kept pace with him, and the wound in her side was a constant, steady note of complaint that she breathed through and did not show on her face. And the keep around them was converting itself from a place she was a prisoner into a place she was, for the first time, responsible for defending. It was an odd feeling. She had expected to feel like an intruder, like a spy, like the enemy's daughter playing a very long and complicated game. She felt, instead, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Kevin found them at East Ward 20 minutes later. His face said everything before his mouth did. The ridge approach, he said, stopping in front of Kylor. We found the first position. How many? 3, he paused. And one of our scouts is missing. Kylor's jaw tightened. Osric, Lysara said. We think so. Kevin looked at her. There's something else. He hesitated, a brief, uncharacteristic hesitation that told her the next thing was significant. The scout who's missing. He was carrying the updated positioning report for the council, the one that included the location of... He stopped. Of what? Kylor said. Of you, Kevin said quietly. Your position in the keep, your personal guard rotation. He paused. Your room. The 3 of them stood on the east ward in the cold dark for exactly 2 seconds. Then Kaelor turned to Lysara with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the controlled urgency of the council room, not the contained grief of the corridor, not the burning intensity of the bond pressing at the edges of everything. This was the expression of a man in whom all the calculating and managing had just been replaced by something much simpler and much more dangerous. "They're not here for you," he said. She had arrived at the same place a half-second behind him. "They're here for you," she said. The walls of Greyspire Keep rose dark and silent around them. Somewhere in the dark below the ridge, 3 of the best operatives her father had ever trained were climbing toward a king, and the scout's report in their possession told them exactly where he slept. 3 operatives, a stolen scout's report, and a king who now knew exactly what was coming for him. Kaelor moved first, not toward safety, toward the problem, which was the direction Lysara had already understood he would move, because she had spent enough hours watching this man to know that his instinct under threat was always forward. She kept pace with him as he crossed the east ward at a controlled run, the cold night air cutting against her face, the wound in her side registering each stride with that insistent, rhythmic complaint she had learned to file and ignore. "They'll go for your room first," she said, matching his pace. "That's the report they have. Your personal guard rotation, your position in the keep. Osric runs linear. He identifies the primary target location and he moves to it directly. He doesn't improvise in the field unless forced." "You know his method that well?" Kaelor said without slowing. "I watched him plan 3 operations over 6 years. My father used to brief his inner council on extraction and neutralization protocols." She paused for a breath. "He called them administrative reviews. I took notes." Kaelor glanced at her. Brief, sideways, with something that would have been amusement under different circumstances. "Administrative reviews. My father was a man who liked euphemisms," she said. They reached the inner corridor junction, where Cavan was already assembling 4 of the keep's senior guard, 2 of them pulling on additional armor with practiced speed, all of them wearing the expression of soldiers who had gone from ready to active in the space of a single briefing. "Position," Kaelor said. "East Ridge Wall Base," Cavan said. "3rd Squad spotted movement 12 minutes ago. Lost visual. Best estimate puts them inside the outer perimeter already. The guard rotation on the south corridor? Changed on schedule 40 minutes ago. New post. New faces. If they've been watching the keep, they've had time to map the fresh rotation." Cavan paused. "My lord, I need to recommend—" "I know what you're going to recommend," Kaelor said. "The safe room on the 2nd level is exactly where a good operative expects a high-value target to retreat when the outer perimeter is breached," Lysar said. Both men looked at her. "It's the standard response. Osric will have mapped it. If Kaelor goes to the safe room, he's going to a location Osric has already planned for." She held Cavan's gaze. "You don't defend against Osric by going where Osric expects you to go. You defend against him by being somewhere the intelligence he's carrying doesn't account for." Cavan was quiet for a moment. "Where does the intelligence he's carrying not account for?" "My room," she said. Silence. "He doesn't know I'm here," she said. "Your scout's report covers the Alpha King's position and guard rotation. It doesn't cover a Durnhold prisoner on the 3rd floor because that information wasn't in the documents your scout was carrying." She looked at Kaelor. "Osric's map of this keep has a blank space. We need to be in that blank space." Kaelor looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. "Cavan," he said, "take 4 guards to the south corridor and hold the approach to my room. Make noise. Enough that anyone monitoring the keep's interior can hear that there is active defense at that location." Cavan understood immediately. She could see it in the way his expression shifted from uncertain to operational. "Draw them to the wrong position. And give us time to find them before they find us," Kaelor said. "Move." Cavan moved. The 4 guards split and flowed down the corridor with the fluid precision of long training, and she and Kaelor went the other direction, toward the stairwell that led up to the 3rd floor, and the corridor that was, as of the last intelligence Osric's team possessed, empty. The East Armory was 2 floors down and 3 corridors over, and she was not going into the dark with just the carving knife under her mattress. "How long to get to the armory?" she asked. 4 minutes round trip, Kaelor said. He stopped at the stairwell, turned, and looked at her. Then, Without particular ceremony, he reached over his shoulder and unsheathed the shorter blade from the crossed scabbards on his back and held it out to her. She took it. The weight was right, not her sword, which was balanced specifically to her grip after 2 years of use, but a quality blade, well maintained, with a hilt wrapped in cord that gave solid purchase even with cold hands. She turned it once, checking the weight and balance, the way Ren had taught her, and nodded. "Third rack from the door," he said, indicating the armory's direction. "If there's time afterward." "There won't be," she said. "No," he agreed. "Probably not." They went up the stairs. The third floor of Grey Spire's east wing had 4 rooms, 2 storage rooms, her room, and a records room at the end of the corridor that she had noted during her morning inventory as the most defensible space on this level. Narrow doorway, no windows, stone walls thick enough to muffle sound, and a secondary exit through a connecting passage that she had identified as the less obvious of 2 possible exit routes from this section of the keep. She told Kaylor this as they moved down the corridor. "You map the 3rd floor," he said. "I map every space I'm in," she said. "It's a habit." "When did you develop that habit?" "When I was 14 and realized that every room I was ever in had been designed by someone else for their purposes, not mine. And the only way to change that was to understand the room better than they did." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a very specific thought for a 14-year-old. "I was a specific 14-year-old, she said. They reached her room. She moved inside without pausing. The fire had burned lower in the hours she'd been gone, the room in gray-orange half-light, and positioned herself where she'd spent the morning calculating, to the left of the door, back against the wall, in the section of the room that anyone entering would not see until they had already committed to the threshold. Kaylor moved to the right side of the door and took a position that mirrored hers. The corridor outside was quiet. She controlled her breathing. Slow, even, the breath pattern Ren had drilled into her for exactly this kind of waiting. Because the waiting was when people made mistakes, when the body's alarm responses began to override the trained mind, when the impulse to move or check or do something became a liability. She held still. Beside her, 3 feet away across the doorframe, Kaylor was equally still. The quality of his stillness was different from hers. Something beneath it that she could almost feel at the edge of her awareness, a heightened alertness that didn't operate through the same pathways her own training used. His wolf, she understood. Reading the air, reading the corridors, reading whatever information the dark carried that her human senses couldn't access. 4 minutes passed. 5. Then, softly, she heard it. Not a sound exactly. An absence of sound in a particular pattern, which was the way highly trained operatives moved through spaces they had mapped in advance. Not footsteps, but the occasional, almost imperceptible interruption of the ambient noise of a stone building at night. The creak of a board that should have been silent. The fractional change in airflow that comes when a body displaces it in a corridor. She felt Kaylor's attention sharpen beside her. Not visible, nothing that moved, but present. He had heard it too. Or rather, he had known it was there 30 seconds before she did. He held up 2 fingers. 2. She nodded. 2 operatives on this floor, which meant one was elsewhere, covering another approach, or already at Kaylor's room following Cavan's deliberate noise, or positioned as a rear guard at the stairwell. She filed the 3rd operative question and focused on the immediate 2. The door to her room was closed but not latched. She had left it that way deliberately when they came in, a slight gap that a practiced eye looking for a cleared and empty room might read as abandoned. Anyone who had checked this floor earlier in the evening and found a single injured prisoner would expect the room to be secured from outside. A closed but unlatched door read as empty. She heard them reach the corridor junction. Pause. A very brief exchange of sounds she couldn't decode. Hand signals communicated as the softest possible movement. Professionals communicating in the minimal vocabulary of a practiced team. Then footsteps. Toward her door. She pressed her back against the stone wall and held the blade at the ready angle Ren had taught her and breathed. The door opened. The first operative came in fast and low, moving to the right. The instinctive tactical choice in a room entered from a left-hinged door, getting out of the fatal funnel, clearing toward the most visible space. He was compact and dark-clothed, and he moved with the specific quality of someone who had done this hundreds of times. And he had his blade out and his eyes sweeping the room. And he was looking at the bed and the window and the fireplace, and the shadow behind the door was not in his immediate scan, because the shadow behind the door is never in the immediate scan of someone entering a room they expect to be empty. She moved. She moved the way Ren had taught her. No warning, no hesitation. The strike aimed at the weapon arm first because disarming was safer than injuring, and injured operatives still had knives. And the objectives here were control and information, and not a body on the floor of a room that told Osric exactly where his targets were. The operative was good. He recovered faster than most people would have, converted from offense to defense in the space of a half second, and the next 4 seconds were close and ugly and operated entirely on trained reflex rather than thought. He was stronger than her. She was faster than him, and she had the wound in her side that meant losing the grapple was not an option, which focused her in a way that strength alone doesn't. She had his blade hand pinned and his own momentum redirected into the wall before he had fully processed what had happened, and she had the edge of Kaylor's borrowed blade at his throat in the moment that the second operative came through the door and found Kaylor waiting. That exchange was significantly shorter. Kaylor moved the way water moves when something large displaces it. Not fast, exactly, but with the absolute efficiency of a body that has been fighting since childhood, and whose wolf enhanced every physical response into something that operated beyond normal human range. The second operative, taller, broader, clearly the physical specialist of the pair, lasted approximately 8 seconds before he was on the floor with both his blades removed and his wrist at an angle that made further resistance a poor choice. Silence. Lysara held her position, the first operative motionless against the wall, her blade at his throat, his weapon on the floor. The operative's face in the firelight was professional and controlled, showing the specific blankness of a man who has been trained to give nothing away even when the situation has shifted decisively against him. She looked at him for a moment. "Osric sent 2 of you to this floor," she said. "Where's the third?" "Nothing." "You came through the ridge approach," she said. "Osric led you in. Where is he now?" The operative's eyes moved, just fractionally, just enough. Not toward the door, downward. She looked at Kaylor. "The lower level," he said. "The records room on the ground floor," she said. "Or the administrative corridor, something that looks like information." She pressed the blade fractionally closer. "Osric doesn't care about killing you," she said to the operative quietly. "He never has. He cares about objectives. His objective tonight is information. Everything this keep has on Durnhold's current military position. Everything the Ironvale Council has gathered. Anything that tells my father what you know and what you're planning." She paused. "And if he finds the 43 pages on the council chamber table." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Kaylor was already moving toward the door. "Hold them both," he said. "I have one," she said. "The floor?" "Cavan's team will be at the stairwell in 2 minutes," he said. "Hold them until then." He left. She looked at the 2 operatives, one against the wall under her blade, one on the floor with both wrists controlled by his own positioning and 2 of his own blades 6 feet away. She considered the geometry of managing 2 trained operatives simultaneously with 1 functioning arm and a wound in her side that was making increasingly insistent demands on her attention. "I want you both to understand something," she said conversationally. "I grew up in the same palace you trained in. I've watched Osric run 12 operations. I know exactly how this team is structured, which means I know that you're the insertion specialist." She looked at the man against the wall. "And you're the security specialist." She looked at the man on the floor. "Which means neither of you is the decision maker on this operation, and neither of you has anything to gain by making this more complicated than it needs to be." She paused. "So let's wait for the Ironvale guards to arrive and do this with dignity." The man on the floor looked at her with the expression of a professional reassessing a situation. "You're the princess," he said. His voice was flat. "Yes." "Osric said you'd be a complication." "Osric was right," she said. What? Cavan arrived with 4 guards 3 minutes later. He took in the room. 2 restrained operatives, Lysara standing against the wall with Kaylor's borrowed blade, and a spreading dark patch on the linen over her left side that was significantly larger than it had been an hour ago, with the expression of a man updating his assessment of a situation rapidly. "My lord," he said. "Ground floor," she said. "Osric, go." He went. She handed off the first operative to two of the guards and allowed herself finally to lean against the wall, just slightly, just enough to take the direct pressure off her left side. The wound had reopened. She could feel the specific warmth of it through the linen. The binding Selah had applied that morning, giving way under the combined demands of the last 2 hours. It was fine. She had done enough. She stood against the wall and breathed and waited. They found Osric in the records corridor. Not at the council chamber. Cavan's team had secured the documents immediately after the council meeting, which meant the 43 pages were in a locked strongbox in the armory rather than on a table where they could be accessed in under 3 minutes. Osric, who had been mid-operation when his 2-person advance team stopped reporting, had pivoted, exactly as she'd described, converting from primary objective to secondary when the primary was blocked, moving to the administrative records with the calm methodology of a man who always had 3 objectives and always completed at least 2. He was 62 years old. He looked like a court administrator. He had 4 of Cavan's guards between him and the exit, and he was standing very still in the corridor with both hands visible, which was the posture of a man who had made a calculation. Lysara reached the corridor on Kaelor's left, Cavan on his right. Osric looked at her. There was no surprise in his face. There hadn't been surprise in Osric's face in 40 years. This was a man who processed every possible outcome before he entered an operation and then moved through actual events by comparing them to the prepared map rather than being affected by them. "Princess," he said. "Osric," she said. "You look unwell." "I've had a difficult day." He looked at Kaelor. "Alpha King." A pause. "The extraction failed." "Yes," Kaelor said. "Varen will know within 48 hours. Osric said it as a simple statement of operational fact, no distress in it, no urgency. "The main force on the road will receive no signal. Protocol is to advance when the extraction team misses check-in." He paused. "You have until tomorrow morning." "I know," Kaelor said. Osric looked back at Lysara. "You planned this." "Most of it," she said. "Not bad," he said, which from Osric was the highest possible assessment. "I learned from watching you," she said, "for 6 years." Something moved across his face. Not quite emotion, not quite pride, but the closest thing to it that a man like Osric carried. "Your father will not stop," he said, quietly enough that it was directed at her and not the room. "You understand that?" "I do." He believes, genuinely believes, that what he did 15 years ago was necessary, that the peace summit was a threat he neutralized. He paused. He is not going to receive evidence of his own wrongdoing and change his position. He doesn't work that way. "I know how he works," she said. "I'm not trying to change his mind." Osric looked at her steadily. "What are you trying to do?" "Remove him from the position where his mind matters," she said. A long silence. "Then you'll need the main army," Osric said. 4,000 soldiers on a main road, moving on a schedule, with officers who answer to the crown and not to your father personally. He paused. "Some of those officers have concerns about the current campaign, concerns they have not voiced." She looked at him. "You're telling me something." "I'm retiring," he said simply. "The extraction failed. My operational value to the king has concluded, and I have been in service to the Durnhold crown since before you were born, and I have done many things in that time, and some of them—" He stopped. "Some of them I have been thinking about for a long time." He looked at her. "The Grafen Path. I am the only person who knows it completely. If I were to provide Ironvale's forces with a complete map of every passable line through that terrain, the 3 battalions on the main road would find their tactical position significantly compromised." The corridor was very, very quiet. "You'd be committing treason," she said. "I would be doing something I should have done 15 years ago," he said. He looked at Kaelor. "I have one condition." Kaelor looked at him. "Name it." "The princess," Osric said, "when this is over. Whatever you decide to do with Durnhold, she is not a casualty of it. Not a prisoner, not a bargaining piece, not a political asset to be traded. He looked at Lysara. You are the best thing that palace ever produced, and you have been wasted for 19 years. And I want your word that you'll still be standing when the smoke clears. She looked at this man, 62 years old, who had served her father for 4 decades and done things she didn't fully want to know about, and was standing in an enemy corridor offering to commit treason on her behalf. And she felt something that was complicated and genuine and did not entirely have a name. You have my word, she said. He looked at Kaelor. She is under my protection, Kaelor said. Unconditionally. Osric nodded. Then I'll need paper, he said. In about 2 hours. With that, he drew the maps from memory at the table in the council chamber, working with the unhurried precision of someone transcribing knowledge that had been perfectly preserved for decades. Every passable line through the Grayfen marsh terrain, every approach, every limitation, every seasonal variation that changed what was possible. He drew the 3 battalions' positions as he'd last known them, noted the officers he assessed as potentially persuadable, and wrote a brief document, factual, specific, signed with his real name, that described the operational orders he had been given and who had given them. Cavan sat across from him, asking precise questions. Harwick arrived 20 minutes in and sat without comment and began reading as the pages were completed. Kaelor stood by the wall and watched. Lysara sat, because Sela had appeared sometime in the last 40 minutes, and reset the wound binding with a pointed silence that communicated strong professional disapproval, and sitting was the compromise between Sela's recommendation of lying down and Lysara's intention to remain present, at the end of the table where she could see Osric's work as it developed. Around midnight, Brennan arrived. She came in without being summoned, which told Lysara that someone had informed her of what was happening, and she had made her own decision about being present. She stood at the end of the room and watched Osric work for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "You were at the summit." Osric looked up. "Yes. You were part of the planning." "I was part of the execution," he said. "I did not plan it. I was given an operational order." He paused. "I carried it out." The room was very quiet. "I know that doesn't—" He stopped. "I know there is nothing I can say about that." Brennan looked at him for a long time. Her face was the face of a woman who has been carrying something for 15 years and has arrived, late in a sleepless night, at a place where the carrying of it is shifting in some fundamental way. "No," she said. "There isn't." She pulled out a chair and sat down and picked up the nearest completed page of Osric's work. "Where is the secondary approach to the South Battalion's supply position?" she said. Osric looked at her. He pointed to the relevant section of the map. She studied it, nodded once. "Continue," she said. Plus, the maps were complete by 2 in the morning. Harwick had already left with 3 of the pages, moving with the quiet urgency of a man who had an operational timeline and intended to meet it. Cavan was coordinating the repositioning of Iron Vale's border forces based on the new terrain intelligence, the information from the afternoon's council session, and Osric's maps combining into a strategic picture that had, in the space of a single night, changed completely. Lysara sat in the council chamber in the gray hour after midnight and felt the particular exhaustion of a body that had been operating on adrenaline and purpose for many hours, and was beginning to present the bill for it. Kaelor sat down beside her, not across the table, beside her. The chair pulled close enough that the sleeve of his shirt was near her arm, not touching, but present in that specific way that the bond made present, that low-frequency awareness of proximity that she had stopped trying to rationalize and had simply started living with. "How's the wound?" he said. "Sela's unhappy with me." "Sela is unhappy with most people," he said. "She considers it a professional obligation." He looked at the table, the maps, the documents, the physical record of everything that had shifted in the last 24 hours. "You stopped an extraction team and turned their senior operative in the same night." "Osric turned himself," she said, "because of you." She looked at the table. "He's been carrying it for a long time," she said. "People do, when they've done something they can't reconcile. They look for a place to put it down." She paused. I just happened to be the thing that made him decide tonight was the night. Don't do that, Kaylor said. She looked at him. Don't make yourself smaller than what you did, he said. His voice was quiet and direct and had that quality she'd noticed in their first real conversation. The absolute absence of performance, the specific weight of a person saying exactly what they mean. You walked into a battlefield carrying evidence against your own father. You talked your way into a council room that had people in it who wanted you dead. You mapped this keep in a single morning and used that map to protect it. You stopped 2 of Aldrich Varen's best operatives with a borrowed blade and a wound in your side. He held her gaze. I have been a king for 7 years and a warrior for longer than that, and I am telling you plainly that what you did tonight was remarkable. Accept that. She looked at him for a moment. The exhaustion was very present. The wound was a steady, deep complaint that Sela's fresh binding had organized but not resolved. The council chamber around them smelled of wood smoke and old maps, and the accumulated weight of a night that had changed the shape of a war. All right, she said. All right? I accept it. He almost smiled. The almost smile was becoming a thing she watched for. That fractional, involuntary softening that appeared when something surprised him into it and disappeared before he could decide to let it stay. Brennan said something to me, he said. After you fell asleep in the field hospital. This was before I told the council who you were. He paused. She said there was something in the way you spoke in that first council session. Something she hadn't heard from anyone carrying the Durnhold name in 15 years. What did she say it was? Truth, he said simply. She said it sounded like truth. Lysara was quiet for a moment. I've been practicing for a long time, she said. I know, he said. So have I. He looked at her. That full, direct look that still had the quality of reading something important. We have a very large problem arriving at our borders in approximately 6 hours. I know. And at some point very soon, the situation will require you to be, publicly, something other than a Durnhold prisoner or an intelligence asset. She understood what he was saying. What will it require me to be? He was quiet for a moment. I have some thoughts about that, he said, but they're significant, and I want you to have slept before I say them out loud. Because they'll sound different in the morning? Because you deserve to hear them when you're not running on blood loss and operational necessity, he said. And because what I want to say requires you to be able to think clearly about what you want, not what the situation demands. What you want. The chamber was very quiet around them. Outside, the first pale suggestion of dawn was beginning at the edge of the shuttered windows. Barely there. More absence of darkness than presence of light. In a few hours, the main Durnhold force would have missed the extraction team's check-in. The protocol would advance. 4,000 soldiers would begin the final movement toward a confrontation that was no longer the war either side had thought they were fighting. But in this moment, in this room, something had shifted. The documents on the table, Osric's maps, Brennan's single word, offered after midnight in an exhausted chamber to a man who had spent 15 years waiting for it. Truth. Lysara looked at the man beside her. This king who had built himself out of grief and determination and 15 years of swearing to destroy something, who was sitting in a council chair at 2 a.m, telling her that what he wanted to say required her to be awake enough to hear it. And she felt something she had not expected to feel inside an enemy keep, with a wound in her side and her father's army 6 hours away. She felt, for the first time in 19 years, that she was on the right side of something. Get some sleep, Kaylor said. He stood and held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took it and let him help her to her feet, and the touch of his hand was that same current she'd first felt on a battlefield in the mud and rain. Recognition, warmth, something old and certain beneath both. She let go before it could become something she'd have to process tonight. 6 hours, she said. 6 hours, he agreed. She walked toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped. Kaylor, she said. He looked at her. The things you want to say, she said. When you say them, I want you to say all of them. Don't manage it. Don't calculate the right version of it. She paused. Say it the way it actually is. He was still for a moment. Yes, he said. She went to sleep. 3 hours later, when the first rider came in with the report that the main Durnhold force had broken camp and was moving, faster now, harder, the pace of an army that had lost its advance team and was converting from retrieval to something older and more blunt, she was already awake, already dressed, already at the map table with Harwick and Cavan, her hand tracing the Grayfen paths Osric had drawn in the small hours of the morning, finding the point where Ironvale's repositioned forces and the incoming army would meet. Finding the place where this would end. The place where it would end was a valley called Sternfeld, a wide, flat stretch of frozen ground 4 miles south of Greyspire Keep, where the main road from Durnhold met the eastern tributary of the Grayfen marshes, and the terrain opened into the kind of space that armies used for the thing armies were built for. Lysara found it on the map at 4 in the morning, tracing the lines Osric had drawn with her finger, measuring distances against the scale markings with the focused attention of someone who understood that the difference between the right ground and the wrong ground was the difference between a battle and a massacre. "Here," she said. Harwick leaned over. He looked at the position. He looked at the marsh tributaries running to either side of it, the high ground to the north that Ironvale's repositioned forces could reach before dawn, the choke point at the valley's southern entrance that would compress Durnhold's 3 battalions into a formation they couldn't easily maneuver out of. "They'll see it," he said. "Their commanders aren't inexperienced." "They'll see the tactical problem," she said. "They won't see what it means about their orders, not until someone tells them." She looked at him. "Who commands the 1st Durnhold Battalion?" Harwick looked at Cavan. "Commander Sev Aldrath," Cavan said without hesitation. "Border Lord's son. Served under your father for 12 years. "Aldrath," she said. "He was in the palace when I was 14. He sat in 3 of my father's strategy meetings. He disagreed with the Eastern trade embargo openly and was told to be quiet." She paused. "He was quiet after that, but he remembered." She looked at Harwick. "He is not a man who does things because he was told to without understanding why. And right now he is marching 4,000 soldiers toward a foreign king's stronghold on orders that tell him he's extracting a missing princess." "He may be extracting a missing princess," Harwick said carefully. "He is marching to recover a political asset his king wants back before she can cause irreversible damage," she said. "There is a difference. And if Aldrath understood what that difference was, if he understood what I took from the archive and what it means and what my father has been building toward, he would not be on this road." The room was quiet. "You want to talk to him," Kaelor said. He had come into the chamber sometime in the last hour. She hadn't heard him arrive, which meant she'd been more absorbed in the maps than she'd realized. He was standing behind her, close enough that she was aware of him in that specific, persistent way, looking at the position she'd marked on Osric's map. "I want to be at Sternfeld when the armies meet," she said. "And I want to speak before anyone draws a weapon." "That is," Harwick said, in the careful tone of someone choosing words precisely, "an extraordinarily dangerous position. I know. You would be standing between 2 armies, one of which is under orders from your father, in a position where any single actor who decides to take initiative—" "I know," she said again. She turned to look at Kaelor. "Tell me it won't work." He looked at her for a long moment. That reading look, measuring, taking in everything she was saying and everything she wasn't. "I can't tell you that," he said, "because it might work." "Because it might work," he agreed, "and because you are the only person who could make it work." He paused. "You are the first princess of Durnhold. You have the documents. You have Osric's testimony. You have the specific, particular quality of being undeniably real in front of people who have only dealt with abstractions." He was quiet for a moment. "A war is easier to fight when the people on the other side are categories. When they become people, it's harder." "That's what I'm counting on," she said. Harwick was looking between them with the expression of a military man processing a plan that violated most of his operational instincts, but that he couldn't find a structural flaw in. "What do you need?" he said, finally. "Ironvale's forces on the high ground before dawn," she said. "Positioned visibly. I want Aldrath to be able to see them when he arrives at the valley entrance and understand immediately that the tactical situation is not in his favor. I don't want him to feel trapped. I want him to feel that fighting is a choice he's being offered the opportunity not to make. She looked at the map. And I need a white flag and a horse and someone to ride out with me who Durnhold's officers will recognize as Ironvale's official voice. That would be me, Kaelor said. She turned to look at him. I'm not sending you out there alone, he said. You're the Alpha King of the kingdom they're marching against, she said. Your presence either elevates the conversation or makes it impossible. It depends on how the conversation starts, he said, which is why it starts with you. He held her gaze. I'll be 3 steps behind. You speak first. I speak when it helps. She looked at him for a moment. The dawn light was beginning at the windows now, pale, thin, the reluctant arrival of a morning that carried everything the night had built toward. 3 steps behind, she said. 3 steps, he said, not 30. She turned back to the map. Then we need to move in an hour. They rode out of Greyspire Keep in the gray pre-dawn with 40 of Ironvale's best soldiers flanking at a distance, close enough to respond, far enough not to read his aggression, and a white flag carried by a rider at the front, the cloth pale and steady in the cold morning air. Lysara rode at the center of the formation on a gray horse she had not chosen and had no particular relationship with, which meant she spent the first mile of the ride simply learning the animal, its rhythm, its sensitivities, the specific quality of its attention. By the second mile, she had the horse's trust, which was the first thing Ren had taught her about riding in conditions that might become unpredictable. The horse knows something is wrong before you do, and a horse that trusts you will tell you. Kaelor rode to her right, exactly 3 steps behind, which he had measured with the literal precision of a man who had said a thing and intended to do it exactly. The valley of Sternfeld opened ahead as they crested the last hill before the flatland. And there it was, the wide frozen ground catching the first pale light, the high ground to the north where Ironvale's repositioned forces were visible on the ridge in organized rows, the southern approach where the road from Durnhold emerged from between 2 stone outcroppings and flattened into the valley floor. And on that road, already visible, the Durnhold vanguard. They had arrived faster than estimated. She registered this as a tactical fact without the emotional content of it, the way she registered most dangerous information. The 1st Battalion was at the valley entrance. She could see the Durnhold standard, gold and gray diagonal, the crest she had grown up under, the crest that was also hers, moving at the front of a force that stretched back along the road as far as the morning visibility allowed. She could see, even at this distance, the moment the vanguard registered the white flag, and the single formation riding toward them. She could see the moment they registered the forces on the ridge. The vanguard stopped. Now, she said, and she rode forward. Commander Sev Aldrath was a broad, gray-templed man of 50, who had the look of someone who had spent his career being right in rooms full of people who outranked him. He had ridden to the front of his vanguard the moment the white flag was spotted, and he sat on his horse at the valley entrance looking at the approaching party with the particular stillness of an experienced commander, processing a situation that didn't match his operational briefing. He recognized her at 20 yards. She watched it happen. The moment his face moved from tactical assessment to something more complicated, the adjustment of a man recalibrating everything he thought he knew about the morning. She stopped her horse 10 yards from him. The 40 Ironvale riders held their position behind her. Kaelor was 3 steps back, exactly as promised. Commander Aldrath, she said, Your Highness? His voice was careful, military in its precision, carrying neither warmth nor hostility, carrying instead the quality of a man who has decided to gather information before forming a position. His eyes moved past her to Kaelor, to the Ironvale forces on the ridge, back to her. This is not the situation I was briefed on. I know, she said. I'd like to explain what the actual situation is, if you'll give me 10 minutes. I have 4,000 soldiers behind me, Your Highness. I know that too, she said. And I have a request that you don't move them forward for 10 minutes while I speak. After 10 minutes, you'll understand why the tactical position on this valley doesn't require you to fight your way through it. She paused. And why it would be a very serious mistake to try. He looked at her steadily. You're asking me to hold on the word of a princess who is standing with Ironvale forces. Well, I'm asking you to hold on the word of a princess who grew up in the same palace you served in for 12 years, she said. You know me. Not well, but you know me well enough to have formed an opinion. She held his gaze. What is your opinion, Commander? He was quiet for a moment. That you are not a fool and never have been, he said. Then believe me when I tell you that what I'm about to say is the most important thing you will hear in your military career, she said, and that the path your king has sent you down leads somewhere you do not want to go. A long silence. The valley around them was extraordinary in its stillness. The frozen ground, the pale morning light, thousands of soldiers on both sides holding the particular stillness of people who are waiting on the words of two people in the middle of a wide, cold field. 10 minutes, Aldrath said. She began to speak. She did not give him the full 43 pages. She gave him the essential architecture, the peace summit, the planning documents, the correspondence between her father and his intelligence chief that made the intention explicit, Osric's name, and what he had provided and where he currently was. She gave it to him in the clear, organized sequence of someone who had been rehearsing this particular argument for 3 years, without embellishment, without emotional manipulation, with the specific weight of documented fact presented by a person who had gone to significant lengths to obtain it. She watched his face while she spoke. She had given this speech, in fragments and portions, to 3 different audiences in the last 48 hours. Kaelor in the stone room at Greyspire, the council in the chamber, and Brennan in the corridor. Each time it had landed differently, because each audience carried different wounds and different investments in the truth. Aldrath carried none of the personal grief that Ironvale's council carried. What he carried was 12 years of service to a king he had disagreed with in specific, private ways that he had never been given permission to voice. She watched the disagreements he had been carrying find the evidence they'd been waiting for. When she finished, the valley was quiet. Aldrath looked at her for a long time. He looked at Kaelor, who had moved from 3 steps behind to 1 step behind somewhere in the middle of her speech, and was now close enough that his horse's breath was visible in the cold air at the edge of her peripheral vision. The documents are at Greyspire, she said. 43 pages, copied by hand from the Palace Restricted Archive. Osric's maps and testimony are there as well. Everything I've told you can be verified. She paused. I am asking you to not engage this valley. I am asking you to hold your force and send a rider back to my father with a message from me. She paused. And I am asking you, when that message produces the response I expect it to produce, to consider whose orders you choose to follow. What message? Aldrath said. She had composed this in the small hours of the morning, in the space between finishing at the map table and lying down for 3 hours of sleep. She had written it on a single page in the council chamber, in her own handwriting, sealed with the only seal she had access to, the ring on her right hand, a small gold piece with the House Varen mark that she had worn since she was 12 years old, and that her father had given her the year before he'd stopped seeing her as a child and started seeing her as a resource. She had held that ring in her hand for 10 minutes before she used it. Then she had pressed it into the wax and let it set and folded the paper and handed it to Cavan to carry. Cavan produced it now. She held it out to Aldrath. Tell him I'm alive and not a prisoner, she said. Tell him I have the documents. Tell him I know everything and that everything is already known. In Ironvale, by its full council, and by enough of his own officers that silence is no longer an option. She paused. And tell him that the next decision he makes will determine whether the accounting that comes is one that ends with Durnhold intact or one that ends with it in pieces. Aldrath took the letter. He looked at it for a moment. This small folded page that contained, she knew, a compressed version of the same information she'd just given him, addressed in her handwriting to her father, carrying the seal of the house he had built his kingdom on. The object of years of fear and careful maneuvering, reduced to a single folded page in a soldier's hand on a frozen valley floor. He won't accept it, Aldrath said quietly. Not a challenge. A statement from a man who knew the person in question. No, she agreed. He won't. Then what happens when he refuses? Then he rides here himself, she said. And we do this in person. She held the commander's gaze. And when he arrives and sees what is waiting for him, 4,000 of his own soldiers who have read those documents, an Ironvale force on the high ground, and his own daughter standing in the middle of it, he will have two choices: accept the accounting or fight a war he cannot win. Aldrath was quiet for a very long moment. He'll choose to fight, he said. I know, she said, and that will be his last choice as a king. The letter reached Aldrich Varen by midday. She was not present for his reading of it. She was 4 miles north, at Greyspire, where the wound in her side had been readdressed by a Sela who communicated her professional displeasure through the specific efficiency of her hands and the pointed silence she maintained throughout the entire procedure. Lysara sat on the edge of the bed she'd been given and let Sela work, and thought about her father reading her handwriting for the first time in 3 weeks. He would read it twice, she knew. He always read important documents twice. Once for content, once to look for the thing between the lines that the content was designed to conceal. He would find, between the lines of this one, the thing she had not tried to conceal, that she had made her position and her allegiance clear, and that she was not coming back. She had been right about one thing and wrong about one thing. She had been right that he would not accept it. She had been wrong about the timeline. She had estimated he would come himself within 24 hours. He came in 6. He arrived at Sternfeld in the late afternoon with a personal guard of 200, and the specific momentum of a man who had decided that what was happening would be resolved in the manner he dictated, because it always had been before. She was already there when he arrived. She had ridden back to the valley 3 hours earlier with Kaelor and Harwick and 40 Ironvale soldiers, and the knowledge that Aldrath had, in the 6 hours since their morning conversation, done something she had not predicted but probably should have. He had gathered his 3 battalion commanders and read them her account of the archive documents, and then he had held a command council, and the result of that council was that the 3 Durnhold battalions were now positioned not at the valley entrance pointing north, but along the valley's eastern edge, perpendicular to both forces, in the specific formation of an army that has declared itself a neutral party to a conflict. She had seen this formation twice in military history texts. She had never expected to see it in real life. When Aldrath had ridden to her position to tell her what his commanders had decided, his face had carried the expression of a man who has made a decision that he knows is the right one and knows is also one he will never be able to take back. The king will consider this mutiny, she had said. Yes, he said. You understand what that means for you personally. I understand what it means for 4,000 soldiers if we engage that valley, he said. I understand what it means for Durnhold if this war continues on your father's terms. And I understand... He stopped. I understand what those documents mean. I've had 6 hours to understand it. He looked at her. My wife's cousin served as an attaché at the peace summit. She was 24 years old. He paused. She was one of the people who didn't come home. The valley had been very quiet when he said that. I'm sorry, she said. So am I, he said. For a great many things. He straightened. The battalions hold the east line. What happens in the middle of this valley is between you, your father, and the Alpha King of Ironvale. She had nodded. He had ridden back to his line, and she had sat on her horse in the cold valley and waited. Her father looked older. This was the first thing she registered when he rode to the center of the valley floor with his personal guard arranged behind him, that he looked older than he had 3 weeks ago, which was either the effect of the last 3 weeks or the effect of seeing him in this context, outside the palace where his authority was ambient and total, in a place where the specific human reality of him was not obscured by architecture and ritual. He was 61 years old. He was tall and silver-haired and still possessed of the particular commanding physical presence that had always made rooms rearrange themselves around him. He sat on his horse with absolute control and looked at her across 30 yards of frozen ground with eyes that she had spent 19 years reading. She had expected fury. She had expected the cold, contained version of it that he deployed when he wanted to communicate that he was not losing control, but that the situation was extremely serious. She had not expected the thing she actually saw, which was something older and more complicated than fury. Something that might, in a different man, have been called fear. He had read the letter, he had understood what it meant, and he had come anyway, because coming was the only response available to him that preserved the shape of the world as he understood it. Lysara, he said. Father, she said. You will come home now, he said. The command phrasing, not a request, not a negotiation, the simple declarative statement of a man who has always made things happen by saying them with enough conviction. No, she said. The word in that valley, in that silence, had a weight that surprised her, not by its difficulty, but by its ease. She had imagined this moment for 3 years, the moment of the direct refusal, and she had imagined it would require something enormous from her. It required, instead, nothing she didn't already have. The documents, he said. His voice had shifted. You took things that don't belong to you. I took copies, she said. The originals are still in your archive, sealed under your cipher, exactly where you left them. She paused. Exactly where you left them because you assumed no one would ever look. What you think you found is documented in 43 pages of your own correspondence and intelligence reports, she said, written in your hand and the hands of your officers, sealed with your cipher, detailing the planning and execution of the ambush that killed Kaelor Draven's mother at the Peace Summit 15 years ago. She let each word carry its full weight. I am not going to debate whether it's real, Father. We both know it's real. You know it better than I do. The valley was absolutely still. She watched something move across her father's face, a shift she had never seen before, not in 19 years. The composed surface of a man who had been managing the shape of reality for decades, cracking along a line that had been forming since the moment she'd taken the first page from the archive and copied it by hand at 3 a.m. in her palace room. The Alpha King of Ironvale is behind me, she said. His council and his forces know everything I know. Commander Aldrath and his battalion commanders know everything I know. Osric is in Ironvale custody and has provided his own testimony and strategic maps. She paused. The accounting exists, Father. It can't be unmade. The only question now is what shape it takes. You are my daughter, he said, and the words came out differently than she expected. Not as a command, not as a reminder of obligation, but with something rawer in them, something that was perhaps the closest her father had come to an honest sentence in 15 years. I am, she said, and I am telling you, as your daughter, that there is one path out of this valley that ends without destroying everything you built. She held his gaze. Abdicate. Not because you were beaten, because the truth existed before I found it, and it has always been going to come out, and choosing to face it now before the war goes further is the only decision that leaves Durnhold intact and its people alive. She paused. I will stand in front of every commander on this field and every member of Ironvale's council and tell them that you chose to face the accounting, that you chose to step down, that you chose your kingdom over your throne. She paused. Or I will stand in the same place and tell them that you didn't. The silence after that was the longest she had ever experienced. Her father sat on his horse and looked at her across 30 yards of frozen ground, and she watched him doing the thing she had never seen him do before. Sitting inside a moment without managing it, without performing the response to it, simply sitting inside the truth of what had happened and what was happening now and what the rest of his life was going to look like in the different directions available to him. She watched him arrive over the course of perhaps 30 seconds at the thing she had known he would arrive at if he was given no alternative. And Durnhold? He said. His voice was quiet now, the commanding register gone. We'll have a ruler, she said, a legitimate one, with a legitimate claim, who knows its institutions and its people and its strategic position. She paused. Me. Another silence. Then Kaelor rode forward from 3 steps behind to 1 step behind, and she heard him stop his horse there, and she felt his presence at her back like something that was both warmth and weight, and she understood that this was the thing he'd done deliberately. Not speaking, not stepping forward as a king commanding a capitulation, but being present as exactly what he was, the man beside her, signaling without words that whatever she offered, he stood behind. Her father looked at Kaelor. Kaelor looked back. No threat in it. No victory performance. The look of a man who has carried something for 15 years and has arrived at the end of the carrying and is deciding what to do with his hands now that they're empty. The exile terms, her father said to Lysara. Name them. Comfortable, she said. Safe. in the coastal territories, where your naval connections can give you a life that isn't nothing. She paused. I'm not interested in punishment. I'm interested in ending this. He looked at her for a long moment. Your mother, he said. You have her eyes. I know, she said. She would have. He stopped. She would have done this. The same thing. The same way. He was quiet for another moment. I have been afraid of that for 19 years. She didn't know what to say to that. She had not prepared for that. I know, she said again. Her father straightened in his saddle. Old habit, the posture of a king that lived in his spine independent of whether he still wore the title. And he reached up to the clasp of his formal traveling cloak, the one that bore the House Varen's seal at the shoulder, and he removed it. He folded it with the deliberate care of a man performing the last official act of a long career. He held it out to her. She rode forward and took it. The weight of it was ordinary, wool and metal. A clasp she had seen her whole life. She held it in both hands and felt the specific gravity of the moment, not in the object, but in the stillness of the valley around it. Thousands of soldiers on three sides, an Iron Veil council represented in the riders behind her, her father's 200 personal guards sitting in absolute silence, a world holding its breath. She turned and held the cloak out to Kaelor. He looked at her. Witness, she said, for Iron Veil. He reached out and took one edge of the cloak, holding it formally between them, the Iron Veil gesture for witness transfer of authority that she had learned from a book she'd read at 16 and had filed away for a future she hadn't known the shape of yet. He held her gaze while he did it, and his eyes were doing that burning thing that contained intensity, but underneath it now there was something she hadn't seen there before. Peace. Not the peace of a finished thing, but the peace of a thing that has been carried so long that setting it down, when the moment finally comes, is not emptiness, but relief. Witnessed, he said. None. The accounting that followed took 3 days. Not in the valley, in Greyspire's council chamber, which was reorganized to accommodate both Iron Veil's council and the Durnhold battalion commanders who had chosen the East Line. Aldrich Varen was present for the first day and absent for the second and third by mutual agreement, having been moved to guest quarters in the keep's south wing with 2 guards and the understanding that the arrangement was voluntary in the ways that mattered. Lysara did not sleep well for any of those 3 days. She was in every session, managing the specific, exhausting work of translating between 2 sets of people who had been enemies long enough that the language of negotiation had to be rebuilt almost from the ground up, establishing shared vocabulary, establishing shared facts, finding the points of agreement that existed underneath the accumulated weight of 15 years of manufactured conflict. It was not dramatic work. It was the quiet, grinding work of sitting in rooms and listening carefully, and finding the precise sentence that both sides could hold without it breaking. Kaelor was beside her for most of it, not speaking for her, never that, but present in the way he had been in the valley, that steady presence that communicated, without requiring words, that whatever position she took would not be undermined from behind. On the second day, Brennan arrived in the middle of a difficult session about border territory and sat down across from a Durnhold colonel named Hess, who had, years ago, been at the Peace Summit as a junior attaché and had survived it and had spent 15 years not talking about what he'd seen. Brennan looked at him across the table and said, in the voice of someone who has decided to put something very heavy down in a room rather than carry it back out, "Tell me what you remember." And Hess, after a long silence, told her. Lysara watched that conversation from 3 seats down and understood that it was the most important thing that had happened in the council chamber in 3 days, and that it had nothing to do with her and everything to do with what she'd started. On the third day, the document was drafted. Not a surrender. There had been fierce resistance to that framing from the Durnhold commanders, and she had supported the resistance, because a peace that reads as defeat creates a generation waiting to reverse it. The document was a formal acknowledgement of what had occurred at the Peace Summit, of the responsibility of the Durnhold crown, of the terms of transition. It was signed by Lysara as Durnhold's regent designate and by Kaelor as Alpha King of Iron Veil, and it was witnessed by Aldrath and by Brennan, whose signature Lysara watched her write with the careful deliberateness of someone performing an act they have waited a very long time to perform. After the signing, the chamber emptied slowly. The particular gradual dispersal of people who have been in a room for a long and significant purpose and are not quite ready to resume ordinary motion. Brennan stopped beside Lysara on her way out. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "The originals. In your father's archive." "I'll have them sent within the month," Lysara said, "sealed and couriered directly." Brennan nodded, paused. "You'll be a good ruler," she said. Not warmly. She was not yet a warm woman toward Lysara, and Lysara did not expect her to be, but with the specific measured weight of an assessment from someone who had been watching very carefully. "I intend to be," Lysara said. Brennan left. Her father left Greyspire on the fourth morning in the gray early light with a small escort and the formal exile document signed and sealed. He did not ask to speak to Lysara before he left. She had stood at the window of the third floor, the room she had been given on her first night, the room where she had lain in the dark and run calculations about 48 hours in her father's intelligence range, and she had watched his horse cross the keep's outer yard and pass through the gate. She had not felt what she expected to feel. She had expected grief or relief, or the particular empty sensation that comes after a long, sustained effort finally concludes. She felt instead something quieter than any of those, something that felt like the last day of a very long winter. Not the dramatic arrival of warmth, but the small, certain knowledge that the coldest part was finished. She heard Kaelor come into the room behind her. She recognized his footsteps without turning. "He's gone," she said. "Yes." She turned from the window. He was standing in the middle of the room, and his expression was the one she had learned to read as the one beneath all the other expressions. The one that wasn't performing anything, that was just the actual content of what he was. "You said you had things to say," she said, "when I'd slept and wasn't running on blood loss." "I've said some of them," he said. "In parts, over several days. The ones you were calculating." "Yes." He paused. "The ones I haven't calculated are the ones I said I'd say the way they actually are." She waited. "I have spent 15 years," he said, "building everything I am and everything I've done around one direction. One destination. I understood the grief and I understood the anger and I understood the war and I understood what I was working toward because those things were clear." He paused. "You are not clear. You are the least clear thing that has happened to me in 15 years. You walked onto a battlefield, and your name was everything I swore I would destroy, and your presence is—" He stopped, started again. "The bond is not subtle. I told you that. But the bond is also— It is not only the bond. I want to be precise about that. I know my wolf's knowing from my own knowing. What I know on my own is that you are the most remarkable person I have encountered. That the way your mind works is something I want to be in the presence of for—" He paused. "For a very long time." The room was very quiet. "That was," she said, "almost exactly the way it actually is." "Almost?" "The part where you said, 'I am remarkable,'" she said. "That was still slightly calculated." The almost smile came. This time it stayed. It became an actual smile. Brief, genuine, transforming his face in the way of someone who has been doing something for such a long time that they've forgotten the thing they were doing before it. "You," he said, "are going to be entirely impossible to manage." "I have never been manageable," she said. "I thought you understood that." "I did," he said. "I'm adjusting my plans accordingly." She looked at him. This man who had spent 15 years as a weapon aimed at a single target and was now standing in a stone room in the morning light figuring out what a person does when the war is over. And she felt the bond, and she felt her own knowing, and she found, as Ren had always told her she would find in the moments that mattered most, that the two things were saying the same thing. "The things you want to say," she said. "Say the rest of them." He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, close enough that the bond was a physical presence between them, warm and certain and persistent. He looked at her with those silver-gray eyes that had been burning since the first moment she'd opened hers, and found him looking down at her on a battlefield in the rain. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as a political necessity, not as a strategic alliance, as what you are. To me." He paused. "I want to be what I apparently already am to you, and I want to do the very large and complicated work of whatever comes next. 2 kingdoms, 2 councils, the document we signed, your father's exile, the Durnhold transition, all of it, with you beside me rather than behind me or ahead of me." He paused. 3 steps beside me. She thought about a palace built on lies, and a sword in her hand in a cold training yard, and 43 pages copied by hand in the dark, and a battlefield, and a bond, and a stone room, and 3 days in a council chamber finding the sentences that both sides could hold. She thought about her mother's eyes, which were also her eyes, which had apparently always made her father afraid. She thought about what Wren had told her in a cold yard years ago, about the ability to endure pain without showing it being the skill that would keep her alive. He had been right, and he had also been teaching her, she understood now, something he probably hadn't known he was teaching, not just to survive pain, but to survive long enough to arrive at the moment when pain was no longer the only thing present. This was that moment. "Yes," she said. Tot. They married 6 months later under a full moon in the valley of Sternfeld, the same frozen ground that had witnessed the beginning of the end, now covered in the first thin grass of an early spring, the high ground to the north where Ironvale's soldiers had stood rank, now dotted with the combined banners of 2 kingdoms. Both councils were present. Aldrath stood with the Durnhold delegation and held himself with the particular dignity of a man who had made the right choice at the right moment and knew it. Brennan stood with Ironvale's council and wore an expression that had, over 6 months, evolved from the careful assessment of someone deciding whether to trust into something that was not yet warmth, but was the genuine predecessor of it. Osric was there, standing at the far edge of the gathered crowd, quiet and self-contained in the way he had always been, watching with the expression of a man who has put something down and is learning what his hands do now that they're empty. He had been offered a formal position in the transition administration. He had declined with a brevity that carried its own dignity. He attended the ceremony as a private individual, which was, Lysara thought, exactly the right thing. Sella was there, and spent most of the ceremony visibly assessing Lysara's posture for signs of inadequate wound recovery, which was so entirely consistent with her character that Lysara found it almost comforting. The vows were not the ceremonial kind, not the formal language of treaty marriage, not the political vocabulary that had governed every alliance between kingdoms in living memory. They had decided this together, early in the 6 months, in a late-night conversation in the council chamber that had started about administrative structures and gradually become something else. They had decided that the vows would be the true thing, not the diplomatic version, not the calculated version, the way it actually was. She spoke first. "I came onto a battlefield carrying the truth," she said, "and the truth brought me here, to you, to this. I don't have a language for what you are to me that doesn't sound like the bond, but I know the difference, and I'm telling you, it is not only the bond, it is the 3 steps behind me on a frozen field. It is the borrowed blade. It is every room you've sat in with me working through the hard and necessary things without performing certainty you didn't have." She paused. "I will be beside you for the work, for all of it, for as long as the work takes." He looked at her when she finished with those silver-gray eyes in the moonlight, and she watched him arrive at the decision she had already seen in him for 6 months, the decision to be exactly what he was, out loud, in front of 2 kingdoms and a full moon and every person they had brought through the last 6 months with them. "I swore 15 years ago to destroy the thing that destroyed my family," he said. "I kept that oath in every way except the most important one. I never understood that the thing I needed to destroy was not a bloodline or a kingdom. It was the lie that had been built to separate 2 peoples who had no reason to be enemies." He paused. "You destroyed that lie. You carried it onto a battlefield, and you laid it down in the light where it couldn't survive the exposure." He paused. "I am the Alpha King of Ironvale. I have been a warrior since I was 15. I have been many things. I have never—" He stopped. I have never been as afraid of anything as I was of you, of what you meant, of what the bond meant, of what it required me to become. He held her gaze. I became it anyway. You made that possible. He paused. I will be beside you for the work. 3 steps beside. The full moon above Sternfeld was enormous and cold and beautiful, throwing long silver light across the valley floor and the gathered crowds and the 2 banners, Ironvale's black wolf, Durnhold's gold and gray diagonal, that had been raised side by side on a single standard that morning by a young soldier who had asked, with the solemn attention of someone performing something important, if he'd gotten the spacing right. He had gotten the spacing right. The crowd was quiet in the way of people who have witnessed something true in a world where true things are not always easy to come by, and the quiet had a warmth in it that had nothing to do with the temperature of the night. Lysara looked at the man in front of her. This Wolf King, this grieving boy made into something extraordinary by 15 years of refusing to stop. And she felt the bond and her own knowing saying the same thing, and she let herself feel it fully, without managing it, without calculating it, the way she had asked him to speak, the way it actually was. Which was this. Remarkable. The word he had said to her in a stone room, and that she had deflected because it was slightly calculated, but which was, stripped of calculation, the truest sentence available. What they had done was remarkable. What they were building was remarkable. And it had started on a battlefield in the rain, with a borrowed blade and 43 pages of truth, and a woman who had decided that whatever was ahead of her was preferable to whatever was behind. She had been right.